Introduction. David Christopher Lane. We live in amazing times primarily because of the great advances science has made since the era of Galileo Galilei. Whereas the average lifespan in the 16th century was roughly around 39 years, today we can expect on average to live close to 80 years. We take for granted luxuries that were mostly unimaginable in years past. From air conditioning to antibiotics to jet airlines to a cornucopia of nutritious food. These benefits and many more are the result of scientists trying to best understand the world around us without relying on mythological stories of the past or outdated religious ideas. While there are countless numbers of scientists who have contributed to our well-being, there are a few that stand out amongst the rest for their remarkable accomplishments. I recently came upon an old book entitled Famous Men in Science by Sarah Knowles Bolton that was first published in 1889. In her enjoyable and easy-to-read text, Bolton provides a glimpse of 14 distinguished thinkers, ranging from such luminaries as Carl Linnaeus to Louis Agassiz. Since the book is not readily available, here at the MSAC Philosophy Group we thought it might be helpful to select 4 biographies from famous men in science and republish them in a new and readable format. To cover some of the major breakthroughs in the past 4 centuries, we have chosen Galileo, astronomy, Newton, physics, Lyell, geology, and Darwin, biology. It is our hope that these small biographical vignettes will serve as intellectual appetizers and may whet the reader's appetite for more. In reading over the life and work of these eminent scientists, one comes away with a great and renewed hope for humankind, and one can better appreciate why so many great thinkers today echo Bernard of Chartres' famous words, who opined, "Nanos gigantum humeris incidentes," standing on the shoulders of giants. Although Newton's citation of the same is more well known, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," his use of the phrase, some conjecture, was a not-so-subtle way of slighting his contemporary rival, Robert Hooke, who reportedly had a small frame and suffered curvature of the cervical and lumbar regions of the spine. I bring this up here because I think it is important to realize that even though science is an extremely laudable enterprise, it is a thoroughly human affair, and thus even the most impressive of scientists may display common weaknesses and foibles. For instance, one may be surprised to learn that Galileo, for all of his adventurous spirit, actually recanted his belief in the Copernican notion that the Earth revolves around the Sun. As the noted Harvard professor of law Alan Dershowitz summarized in his introduction to The Galileo Affair by Maurice A. Finocchiaro, Galileo went even further and abjured as completely false the opinion that the sun is the center of the world and the earth is not the center of the world and moves. But Dershowitz points out that even though Galileo perjured himself, allowing himself to be given a lesser sentence, his ideas couldn't be dismissed, since ideas can be destroyed only by a different kind of trial, the trial of history, which no tyrant has yet been able to control. Science may well be the greatest single process ever developed in the human mind. It is our ability to guess and to experiment, and then test our observations and predictions against others in the same pursuit. But the linchpin in all of this is our ability to admit to being wrong or mistaken in our map-making, and thus allow for new changes and improvements. The fundamental difference between science and religion is often overlooked. Religion presumes to already know the truth and thus attempts to conform humankind to its particular revelations. whereas science makes no such presumption and wants to discover how the world works and therefore tests its observations in the here and now, always open to being corrected in time when new information arises. I often tell my students that the genius of Darwin is not only that he uncovered the mechanism of natural selection and how evolution could occur without a designer, but that in just one sentence he told his numerous readers how his entire theory could be dead wrong. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all in science is that admitting to one's mistakes is in itself no mistake. Galileo Galilei. The same memorable day is marked by the setting of one of the most brilliant stars in the firmament of art and the rising of another in the sphere of science, which was to enlighten the world with beams of equal splendor. On the 18th of February, 1564, Michelangelo Buonarroti closed his eyes at Rome, and Galileo Galilei first saw the light at Pisa. Thus writes young Carl von Gebler in the best life of Galileo ever written, his dying contribution to literature. Some other authorities place Galileo's birth on February 15. He was the oldest in a family of 5 children born to Vincenzo Galilei, a Florentine noble, and Giulia Ammannati, who also belonged to an ancient family. Vincenzo wrote learnedly about music and taught his boy to play on the lute and the organ. But he was poor, and life was a struggle. However beneficial poverty may be in the development of character, most of us do not crave it for our children. So Vincenzo decided to place his son where he could earn a comfortable support. Music did not bring money. Galileo therefore should become a dealer in cloth, a necessity of life rather than a luxury. But the boy soon showed great skill in music, surpassing his father. He excelled in drawing and colour and could have become a noted artist. He loved poetry and had a decided taste for mechanics, making machines of great ingenuity. It soon became evident that such a lad would not be satisfied to spend his life trading in wool. He must be educated, but how? The family had moved from Pisa, where there were schools of repute, to Florence. An effort had to be made by the greatest economy to prepare Galileo to go up to the Pisan University. He showed great aptitude for Latin and Greek, and at 17 was ready for Pisa. For what profession should he study? Not what best suited his tastes, but that in which his father thought he could make money: medicine. Poor Vincenzo! Who can blame him that he hated poverty for his brilliant son? At college, Galileo became an ardent student of philosophy, and because he dared to think for himself and did not always agree with the teachings of Aristotle, he was called the Wrangler. Until he was 20, he was scarcely acquainted with the rudiments of mathematics, because his father thought this study was a waste of time for a man who was to become a physician. How many parents make the mistake of bending their children to their own plans, instead of ascertaining what a boy or girl can do best in the world, and then fitting him or her for it? While Galileo was studying medicine in Pisa, boarding with a relative, the court of Tuscany came to the city for a few months. Among the suite was Ostilio Ricci, a distinguished mathematician and governor of the pages of the Grand Ducal Court. He was a friend of the Galilei family and was pleased to see the bright young son Galileo. When he taught Euclid, the medical student would stand shyly at the schoolroom door and listen with intense interest. Soon he began to study mathematics secretly, then begged Ricci to teach him, who gladly consented, till the father forbade it, seeing that Euclid interfered with medicine. Meantime, the youth of 19, kneeling at prayers in the Pisa Cathedral, had dreamily watched a bronze lamp swinging from an arch. The oscillations were at first considerable, but as they grew less and less, Galileo observed that they were all performed in the same time, measuring the time by feeling his pulse. The idea occurred to him that an instrument could be constructed which should mark the rate and variation of the pulse. He began to experiment and soon invented the pulsilogia, which the physicians hailed with great delight. The pendulum was not applied to clocks till a half-century later, but its invention attracted the attention of all scholars. After 4 years' residence at Pisa, Vincenzo Galilei appealed to the reigning Grand Duke, Ferdinand de' Medici, to grant to his son one of the 40 free places founded for poor students. But the request was denied, and Galileo, unable to pay for his doctor's degree, was obliged to leave the university without it. Already he had learned bitter lessons of privation and disappointment, but youth has a brave heart and looks ever toward the sunlight. He went back to his home in Florence to study the works of Archimedes, whom he called his master, to write his first essay on his hydrostatic balance, and to earn the reputation of a bold inquirer in geometrical and mechanical speculations. The father had now given up all hope of a fortune coming through medicine. Henceforward the genius which was to shed lustre on his own name, otherwise buried in obscurity, was to have its own bent and work out its own destiny. If we are in earnest, a door opens sooner or later, but our own hands usually open it. At 24, a door opened to Galileo. Marquis Guidobaldo, a celebrated mathematician, appreciating what the young scientist had done, began a correspondence with him, and a valuable friendship resulted. The Marquis asked him to study the position of the center of gravity in solid bodies. Galileo applied himself to it and wrote a valuable essay, which waited 50 years for publication. Perhaps no person can be really great who has not learned patience, and Galileo had many lessons in this virtue before he died. Through the influence of the Marquis, he was brought to the notice of Ferdinand I, reigning Grand Duke, who appointed him to the mathematical professorship at Pisa. This was a great honor for a man of 26, one who had been too poor to take his degree. The salary was small, less than $100 a year, but he earned somewhat by the practice of medicine, by lectures on Dante and other literary subjects, and by lessons to private pupils. Of course, he had little or no leisure, but he thus learned one of the most valuable lessons of life: to treasure time as though it were gold. How glad his father and mother must have been that their wool projects had come to naught. The professors at Pisa, with a single exception, Jacopo Mazzoni, in the chair of philosophy, were opposed to the newcomer. They were all disciples of Aristotle, and had not Galileo, when a boy among them, dared to oppose the great Grecian? And now, to make matters worse, he had taken some friends to the top of the Leaning Tower, and had put to the test the belief of 2,000 years, that the rate at which a body falls depends upon its weight. When the different weights fell to the pavement at the foot of the Leaning Tower at the same time, the learned were astonished. If Aristotle could be wrong in one thing, he might in others, and this young man would revolutionize the teaching of the times. The feeling became so strong against the investigator that after 3 years at Pisa he resigned. When will the world learn toleration for those whose opinions are different from the popular thought? From Galileo to Darwin, we have persecuted the men and women whose views were unlike our own in theology, in science, or in social matters. Through his friend, the Marquis Guidobaldo, the mathematical professorship at Padua was obtained for Galileo. He was now 29 and becoming widely known throughout Italy. His father had just died, leaving the whole family, a wife and 4 children, dependent upon him for support. Not a small matter for an ambitious and hard-working professor. Padua gave the young man cordial welcome. Vincenzo Pinelli, a learned nobleman who possessed 80,000 volumes, mentioned him to Tycho Brahe, the great Danish astronomer, as a man whom it would be well to cultivate. But the Dane was too cautious about his own reputation and did not write Galileo till 8 years later, and died the following year. An associate of Tycho Brahe was wiser than his master and sent Galileo his new book, Prodromus Dissertationem Cosmographicum. A warm letter of thanks went back to the immortal John Kepler, saying, "Many years ago I became a convert to the opinions of Copernicus, and by that theory have succeeded in fully explaining many phenomena which, on the contrary hypothesis, are altogether inexplicable. I have drawn up many arguments and compilations of the opposite opinions, which, however, I have not hitherto dared to publish, fearful of meeting the same fate as our master Copernicus, who, although he has earned for himself immortal fame amongst the few, yet amongst the greater number appears as only worthy of hooting and derision, so great is the number of fools." John Kepler, like Galileo, lived a pathetic life. His childhood was spent in the little beer shop of his wretchedly poor father. At 6, he had a severe attack of smallpox, and his eyes were permanently weakened. He was put to the plough, but his delicate body could not bear the work. At last, through charity, he became a theological student at Tübingen. But here he began to think for himself and probably would have been obliged to leave the university. Fortunately for science, he heard some lectures given by Michael Mostlin, famous in mathematics and astronomy. A new world opened to Kepler. He applied himself with all the ardour of youth and at 22 became professor of mathematics at Graz in Styria. He was soon driven away from this Catholic stronghold on account of his Protestant faith. Tycho Brahe heard of his needs and made him his assistant at Prague with a salary of $750 a year. This seemed regal splendor to the poor astronomer. Now he studied the heavens with hope and delight. But sorrows soon came. His children died. His wife became insane and died also. The salary could not be paid on account of the religious wars which convulsed Germany. He wrote almanacs, took private pupils, and in all ways tried to support his second wife and children, while he studied the heavens year by year, discovering his 3 great laws. The mathematical calculations for the first law, that the planets move in elliptical orbits round the Sun, which is placed at one of the foci, filled 700 pages. His Harmonies of the World contained his 3rd great law. The squares of the periodic times of the planets are proportioned to the cubes of their mean distances from the Sun. Such was his joy when he discovered this law after 17 years of labour that he said, "I have written my book. It will be read, whether in the present age or by posterity matters little. It can wait for its readers. Has not God waited 6,000 years for one to contemplate his works?" In a last fruitless attempt to recover 29,000 florins owed him by the government, worn out with want and disappointment, he fell ill and died at Ratisbon, leaving 33 works, 22 volumes in manuscript, and his family in the direst poverty. Such was the man who admired Galileo in his youth, and who stands with him in the admiration of the generations that have come and gone since these 2 men lived and wrote and suffered. At Padua, Galileo soon attracted great numbers to his classroom. Often 1,000 gathered to hear his lectures, and when the hall was too cramped, he spoke to the people in the open air. He was above the middle height, well-proportioned with cheerful countenance, witty in conversation, and enthusiastic in manner. So learned that he could repeat by heart much of the works of Virgil, Ovid, Horace, and Seneca. He was yet modest and unassuming, saying that he never met a man so ignorant but that something might be learned from him. He labored incessantly. He wrote treatises on fortifications, on mechanics, on mnemonics, on the laws of motion, on the celestial globe, which were copied by his pupils and sent by them far and wide over Europe. He took a workman into his family and began to superintend the making of the compass, which he had invented, and the thermoscope, or heat indicator, which led in later years to the thermometer. His experiment was made by a glass bottle about the size of a hen's egg, the neck of which was 2 palms long, and as narrow as a straw. Having well heated the bulb in his hands, he placed its mouth in a vessel containing a little water, and withdrawing the heat of his hand from the bulb, instantly the water rose in the neck more than a palm above the level of the water in the vessel. During the first 6 years at Padua, his salary rose from about $100 to $500 yearly. All this time, when his mind should have been free from care for his great work, he was beset with difficulties. His sister, Virginia, had married before his father's death, but a promised dowry had never been paid, and now the brother-in-law demanded the payment. The mother, worried over the prospect, wrote to her son Galileo, "If you carry into effect your intention of coming here next month, I shall be rejoiced. Only you must not come unprovided with funds, for I see that Benedetto is determined to have his own, that is to say, what you promised him. And he threatens loudly that he will have you arrested the instant you arrive here. And as I hear you bound yourself to pay, he would have the power to arrest you, and he is just the man to do it. So I warn you, for it would grieve me much if anything of the kind were to happen." Livia, another sister, had become engaged to a Pisan gentleman with the promise of a dowry of 1,800 ducats, 800 of which must be paid down. The Pisan gentleman could not burden himself with a wife without funds to help support her and himself. So Galileo generously, if not wisely, borrowed 600 ducats and paid the necessary 800, giving his sister beautiful clothes and house furnishings. Besides these sisters, Galileo had a lazy brother to provide for, Michelangelo, a young man of some musical talent and elegant manners, with the not unusual gift of being able to spend much and earn little. Galileo obtained a situation for him with a Polish prince, and spent 200 crowns in getting him ready for the new position. He went thither, but soon returned, and another place had to be procured for him, at the court of the Duke of Bavaria. While there, instead of helping to pay his sister's dowry as he had promised, he married, had an extravagant wedding feast, and then wrote his hard-working brother, "I know that you will say that I should have waited and thought of our sisters before taking a wife, but good heavens, the idea of toiling all one's life just to put by a few farthings to give one's sisters, this yoke would be indeed too heavy and bitter, for I am more than certain that in 30 years I should not have saved enough to cover this debt." With all the pressure upon him for money, Galileo kept steadily on in his absorbing studies. In the year 1609 he constructed a telescope. It is true that Hans Lippershey of Germany had invented a spyglass and presented it to Prince Maurice, so that the principle was understood, but nobody gave it practical illustration till Galileo, having heard of the glass, began to reflect how an instrument could be made to bring distant objects near. In a leaden tube he fixed 2 glasses, both having one side flat, and the other side of the one concave and the other convex. By this, objects appeared 3 times nearer and 9 times larger. A few days later he hastened with his leaden tube to Venice to exhibit it to the Doge and the Senate. He wrote to a friend, "Many gentlemen and senators, even the oldest, have ascended at various times the highest bell towers in Venice to spy out ships at sea, making sail for the mouth of the harbour, and have seen them clearly, though without my telescope they would have been invisible for more than 2 hours. The effect of this instrument is to show an object at a distance of, say, 50 miles, as if it were but 5 miles off. Perceiving of what great utility such an instrument would prove in naval and military operations, and seeing that His Serenity greatly desired to possess it, I resolved 4 days ago to go to the palace and present it to the Doge as a free gift. And on quitting the presence chamber, I was commanded to bide a while in the hall of the Senate, whereunto, after a little, the Illustrissimo Prioli, who is procurator and one of the reformatori of the university, came forth to me from the presence chamber, and, taking me by the hand, said, that the Senate, knowing the manner in which I had served it for 17 years at Padua, and being sensible of my courtesy in making it a present of my telescope, had immediately ordered the illustrious reformatori to elect me, with my good will, to the professorship for life, with a stipend of 1,000 florins yearly. This must have been a comfort to the now famous Galileo, as it was doubtless to the useless Michelangelo and the 2 brothers-in-law. He could now live in comparative peace and rest. On his return to Padua, he began eagerly to study the heavens. He found that the surface of the moon was mountainous, that the Milky Way was composed of an immense number of small stars and nebulous matter, that Orion, instead of being made up of 7 heavenly bodies, had over 500 stars, and that the Pleiades were not 7, but 36. In January 1610 he discovered the 4 moons of Jupiter, and that they revolved around him. July 25 of the same year he discovered the ring of Saturn. In October the phases of Venus, and later the solar spots. Florence and Padua were in a blaze of excitement. These new discoveries seemed to prove that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but that Copernicus was right when he declared the sun to be the center. Great opposition began to develop itself. Some of the Aristotelians declared that the telescope of Galileo showed things which do not exist. It was ridiculous, they said, that 4 planets, Jupiter's moons, were chasing each other around a large planet. It is angels who make Saturn, Jupiter, the Sun, etc. turn round. If the Earth revolves, it must also have an angel in the center to set it in motion. But if only devils live there, it would, therefore, be a devil who would impart motion to the Earth. The planets, the Sun, the fixed stars, all belong to one species, namely that of stars. They, therefore, all move or all stand still. It seems, therefore, to be a grievous wrong to place the Earth, which is a sink of impurity, among the heavenly bodies, which are pure and divine things. Libri, one of the Pisan professors, spoke of the new discoveries as celestial trifles. When he died, Galileo naively remarked, "Libri did not choose to see my celestial trifles while he was on earth. Perhaps he will now he is gone to heaven." Galileo now longed for freedom from teaching, that he might have his time for study and writing. He had planned, he said, 2 books on the system of the universe, an immense work, idea, concetto, full of philosophy, astronomy, and geometry. 3 books on local motion, a science entirely new, no one either ancient or modern having discovered any of the marvelous accidents which I demonstrate in natural and violent motions, so that I may, with very great reason, call it a new science, discovered by me from its very first principles. 3 books on mechanics, 2 on the demonstration of its first principles, and 1 of problems. And though this is a subject which has already been treated by various writers, yet all which has been written hitherto, neither in quantity nor otherwise, is the quarter of what I am writing on it. I have also various treatises on natural subjects, on sound and speech, on sight and colours, on the tide, on the composition of continuous quantity, on the motion of animals and others. Besides, I have also an idea of writing some books on the military art, giving not only a model of a soldier, but teaching, with very exact rules, all which it is his duty to know that depends on mathematics. As, for instance, the knowledge of encampment, drawing up battalions, fortifications, assaults, planning, surveying, the knowledge of artillery, the use of various instruments, etc. With all this work in mind, he resigned the professorship at Padua and removed to Florence. The Grand Duke Cosmo II giving him a yearly salary of about $1,000 and the title of Philosopher to His Highness. His first thought, as ever, was for his family. He asked an advance of 2 years' salary and paid the dowry debts of his sister's grasping husbands. In 1611, his expenses paid by the Grand Duke, he went to Rome to show his celestial novelties, as they were called, to the Pope and the cardinals. He was received with great attention, and all seemed delighted to look upon the wonders of the heavens, provided always that nothing could be proved against the supposed assertion of the Bible that the earth did not move. Galileo soon published his Discourse on Floating Bodies, which aroused violent opposition. Spots observed on the body of the sun, and the Discourse on the Tides. 4 years later he was again in Rome to plead for the Copernican system and to defend his own conduct in advocating a thing in opposition to the Catholic Church. He said, "I am inclined to think that the authority of Holy Scripture is intended to convince men of those truths which are necessary for their salvation, and which, being far above man's understanding, cannot be made credible by any learning or any other means than revelation by the Holy Spirit. But that this same God, who has endowed us with senses, reason, and understanding, does not permit us to use them, and desires to acquaint us in any other way with such knowledge as we are in a position to acquire for ourselves by means of those faculties, that, it seems to me, I am not bound to believe, especially concerning those sciences about which the Holy Scriptures contain only small fragments and varying conclusions. And this is precisely the case with astronomy, of which there is so little that the planets are not even all enumerated." However, in spite of Galileo's logic, the Church decreed that all books which stated the Copernican system as true should be prohibited. As a mathematical hypothesis, it might be speculated upon. This was a great disappointment to Galileo, who loved and revered the Roman Catholic faith. He went home to the Villa Segni at Bellosguardo near Florence, and for 7 years led a studious and secluded life. His greatest comfort during these quiet years was the devotion of his daughter, Polissena, who had entered a convent as Sister Maria Celeste. While in Padua, Galileo had 3 children by Marina Gamba, a Venetian woman of inferior station. She afterwards married a man of her own class, and Galileo took his children to his own home, a condition of things possible with the low moral standard of the time. The 2 daughters were placed in a convent, while the son, Vincenzo, was educated for the profession of medicine. But he seems to have been a disappointment and a source of discomfort. Maria Celeste in the convent of St. Matthew, loving and tender and helpful to all around her, wrote constantly to the man whom she idolized. "I put by carefully," she says, "the letters you write me daily, and when not engaged with my duties, I read them over and over again. This is the greatest pleasure I have, and you may think how glad I am to read the letters you receive from persons who, besides being excellent in themselves, have you in esteem." Again she writes, "I leave you to imagine how pleased I am to read the letters you constantly send me, only to see how your love for me prompts you to let me know fully what favors you receive from these gentlemen is enough to fill me with joy. Nevertheless, I feel it a little hard to hear that you intend leaving home so soon, because I shall have to do without you, and for a long time too, if I am not mistaken. And your lordship may believe that I am speaking the truth when I say that except you, there is not a creature who gives me any comfort. But I will not grieve at your departure because of this, for that would be to complain when you had cause for rejoicing. Therefore I too will rejoice, and continue to pray God to give you grace and health to make a prosperous journey, so that you may return satisfied and live long and happily, all which I trust will come to pass by God's help. I send 2 baked pears for these days of vigil. But as the greatest treat of all, I send you a rose, which ought to please you extremely, seeing what a rarity it is at this season. And with the rose you must accept its thorns, which represent the bitter passion of our Lord, while the green leaves represent the hope we may entertain that through the same sacred passion we, having passed through the darkness of this short winter of our mortal life, may attain to the brightness and felicity of an eternal spring in heaven. Only in one respect does cloister life weigh heavily on me, that is, that it prevents my attending on you personally, which would be my desire were it permitted. My thoughts are always with you." And so the 7 years of study went by, with the sweet love of Maria Celeste to brighten them. There are none so great that they can live without affection. At the end of the 7 years, Urban VIII came to the pontifical throne, and Galileo and other scientists rejoiced, for he had seemed liberal in thought and generous in heart. When he was cardinal, he had sent a letter to Galileo, saying, "The esteem which I always entertain for yourself and your great merits has given occasion to the enclosed verses. If not worthy of you, they will serve at any rate as a proof of my affection, while I purpose to add lustre to my poetry by your renowned name. Without wasting words, then, in further apologies, which I leave to the confidence which I place in you, I beg you to receive with favour this insignificant proof of my great affection." At Easter 1624, Galileo, now 60 years old, resolved to proceed to Rome to welcome the new pope and urge his approval of the Copernican theory. Frail in health, he was carried most of the way in a litter. During a visit of 6 weeks, he had 6 long audiences with Urban VIII, but, though he was affably received, the Pope was in no wise convinced, but rather tried to convince Galileo that he was in error. Yet so kind was he that Galileo went back to Florence with the hope and belief that he could bring out his great work, Dialogues on the 2 principal systems of the world, the Ptolemaic and Copernican, without opposition from the Church. In this book, Galileo gave the results of scientific research and discovery in the half-century preceding, using such clear yet brilliant style in writing as to make the work attractive even to the unlearned. It was ready for publication in March 1630, but to be sure that the Pope did not object, Galileo was urged to go in person to Rome. He went and presented the matter to Urban, who gave his consent, provided that the title should show that the Copernican system was treated as a hypothesis merely, and that he, the Pope, should write the closing argument. Rather than forego the publication of that upon which he had worked for years, Galileo consented and returned to Florence. A license to publish was then obtained from the Inquisitor General and the Vicar General of Florence after great delay. A second and a third time the papal authorities wished to look over the manuscript. 2 years went slowly by. Other anxieties came to the man of 68 besides the long delay. The impecunious Michelangelo sent his wife, 7 children, and a German nurse to the home of Galileo to be taken care of. The eldest nephew was sent to Rome to study music. He was found to be obstinate, impudent, and dissolute. Wicked ways which his weak and indulgent father said he did not learn from me or anyone else belonging to him. It must have been the fault of his wet nurse. Galileo's son Vincenzo had married and brought his wife home to live. Strange fortune for this man of genius. Strange that he must have helpless relatives and constant pecuniary troubles. Most great lives are as pathetic as they are great. As ever, the one gleam of light was the daily letter from Maria Celeste, in which she expressed a tenderness beyond what any daughter ever had for a father. But I do not know how to express myself except by saying that I love you better than myself. For, after God, I belong to you, and your kindnesses are so numberless that I feel I could put my life in peril were it to save you from any trouble, excepting only that I would not offend his divine majesty. Finally, Galileo moved to Arcetri, over against the convent, to be near the one who alone satisfied his heart. In January 1632, the Dialogues appeared. Copies were sent to his friends and disciples throughout Italy. The whole country applauded, and at last Galileo seemed to have won the homage he had so long deserved. But a storm was gathering. Enemies were at work prejudicing the mind of Urban VIII, making him feel that Galileo had wrought evil to the Church. At once, an order came from the Inquisition to secure every copy in the booksellers' shops throughout Italy, and to forward all copies to Rome. In October of the same year of publication, Galileo was summoned to appear at Rome to answer to that terror of past centuries, the charge of heresy. His friends urged that he was old and feeble, and that he would die on the journey, but Urban's commands were peremptory. Galileo was deeply depressed by the summons, and wrote a friend, "This vexes me so much that it makes me curse the time devoted to these studies, in which I strove and hoped to deviate somewhat from the beaten track generally pursued by learned men. I not only repent having given the world a portion of my writings, but feel inclined to suppress those still in hand, and to give them to the flames, and thus satisfy the longing desire of my enemies, to whom my ideas are so inconvenient." On January 20, 1633, the decrepit old man set out in a litter for Rome, arriving on February 13. On April 12, he was brought before the Inquisition and briefly examined and then remanded to prison, though treated with great leniency. The anxiety and deprivation from outdoor exercise brought on illness, and he was confined to his bed till led a second time before the Inquisition, April 30. Weak, aged, in fear of torture, he made the melancholy confession that his error had been one of vainglorious ambition and pure ignorance and inadvertence. Pure ignorance, from the man who had studied for 50 years all that the world knew of science. But he recalled how men had died at the stake for offending the Church. The world is not full of men and women who can suffer death for their convictions, however much we may admire such courage. On May 10, he was summoned a third time before the Inquisition and told that he had 8 days in which to write his defense. In touching language, he stated how the book had been examined and re-examined by the authorities so that there might be nothing heterodox in it, and then he urged them to consider his age and feeble health. A fourth time he came before the Holy Congregation, June 21, and was asked whether he held that the sun is the center of the solar system, and that the earth is not the center, and that it moves. He replied, "I do not hold and have not held this opinion of Copernicus since the command was intimated to me that I must abandon it. For the rest, I am here in your hands. Do with me what you please." And then June 22 in the forenoon, in the large hall of the Dominican convent of Saint Maria sopra la Minerva, in the presence of cardinals and prelates, he heard his sentence. The proposition that the sun is the center of the world and does not move from its place is absurd and false philosophically, and formally heretical, because it is expressly contrary to the Holy Scripture. The proposition that the earth is not the center of the world and immovable, but that it moves, and also with a diurnal motion, is equally absurd and false philosophically, and theologically considered at least erroneous in faith. Invoking therefore the most holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ and his most glorious Mother and ever Virgin Mary, we say, pronounce, sentence, declare that you, the said Galileo, by reason of the matters adduced in process and by you confessed as above, have rendered yourself in the judgment of this holy office vehemently suspected of heresy, namely, of having believed and held the doctrine, which is false and contrary to the sacred and divine Scriptures, that the sun is the center of the world and does not move from east to west, and that the earth moves and is not the center of the world. We condemn you to the formal prison of this holy office during our pleasure, and, by way of salutary penance, we enjoin that for 3 years to come you repeat once a week the 7 penitential psalms. Galileo was also required to abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies. And then the white-haired man of 70, humbly kneeling before the whole assembly, made the pitiful abjuration of his belief. I abjure with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith. I curse and detest the said errors and heresies, and generally all and every error and sect contrary to the Holy Catholic Church. Pitiful spectacle of intolerance! If we of this 19th century have learned to tolerate and treat with respect the beliefs of others, though widely divergent from our own, perhaps this wretched drama was not acted in vain. It has been said that Galileo exclaimed as he rose from his feet, "Eppur si muove." It moves for all that. But this would have been well nigh an impossibility in the midst of men who would instantly have taken him to a dungeon, and the story is no longer believed. On July 9, poor Galileo was allowed to leave Rome for Siena, where he stayed 5 months in the house of the archbishop, and then became a prisoner in his own house at Arcetri, with strict injunctions that he was not to entertain friends nor to allow the assemblage of many at a time. He wrote sadly to Maria Celeste, "My name is erased from the book of the living." Tender words came back saying that it seemed 1,000 years since she had seen him, and that she would recite the 7 penitential psalms for him to save you the trouble of remembering it. In less than a year, sweet Maria Celeste had said the last psalms for him. She died April 1, 1634, at 33 years of age, leaving Galileo heartbroken. "A woman," he said, "of exquisite mind, singular goodness, and most tenderly attached to me." He went to work on another book, but he said pathetically, "I hear her constantly calling me. Beautiful spirit that will forever shed a halo around the name of Galileo Galilei." In the summer of 1636 he completed his Dialogues on Motion and sent it to Leyden for publication. The next year he made his last discovery, known as the moon's librations. The house at Arcetri had become dark and lonely. The wife of Michelangelo, her 3 daughters and a son had all died of the plague. It was doubly dark, for Galileo had become hopelessly blind, so that this heaven, this earth, this universe, which I by my marvelous discoveries and clear demonstrations had enlarged 100,000 times beyond the belief of the wise men of bygone ages, henceforward for me is shrunk into such a small space as is filled by my own bodily sensations. His last work was a short treatise on the secondary light of the moon. "I am obliged now," he said sadly, "to have recourse to other hands and other pens than mine, since my sad loss of sight. This, of course, occasions great loss of time, particularly now that my memory is impaired by advanced age, so that in placing my thoughts on paper, many and many a time I am forced to have the foregoing sentences read to me before I can tell what ought to follow, else I should repeat the same thing over and over." He had planned other work, but death came on the evening of January 8, 1642, 8 years after Celeste left him. His beloved pupils Torricelli and Viviani and his son Vincenzo stood by his bedside. He desired to be buried in the family vault of the Galilei in Santa Croce at Florence, and the city at once voted a public funeral and 3,000 crowns for a marble mausoleum, but the Church at Rome prevented, lest the pernicious doctrine that the earth moves should thereby have confirmation. He was therefore buried in an obscure corner of Del Noviziato, a side chapel of Santa Croce. A century later, March 12, 1737, in the presence of the learned men of Italy, with great ceremony, the bones of Galileo were removed to a new resting place in Santa Croce and buried with his beloved friend Viviani. An imposing monument was erected over him. The truth finally triumphed, as it always does. The works of Galileo in 16 volumes are no longer prohibited, as they were in his lifetime. Sir Isaac Newton. In the same year 1642 in which Galileo, sad and blind, went away from the earth, Sir Isaac Newton came to make his home upon it. He was born December 25, the only child of Isaac Newton and Hannah Ayscough. The father died at 37, a few months after his marriage, and the young wife, after the birth of her child, was both father and mother to the helpless infant. He was so frail that there seemed little probability that he could live to manhood, or even boyhood. Naturally, between mother and son there grew a most ardent affection which neither time nor death could change. The manor house of Woolsthorpe in Colsterworth, Lincoln County, was a 2-story stone building owned for a century by the Newton family and bringing a limited income from the little farm in connection with it. Here Isaac passed his childhood, going to the schools nearby and learning to read, write, and cipher. At 12, he was sent to the public school at Grantham, where he showed little taste for study and managed easily to stand at the foot of his class. When he was the last in the lowermost form but one, the boy next above him, as they were going to school, gave Isaac a kick which occasioned severe pain. Stirred with wrath, Isaac challenged the boy to a fight. For this purpose they repaired to a neighbouring churchyard where young Newton, though much the smaller and weaker of the two, pounded his antagonist till he was glad to come to any terms of submission. He resolved now that this boy should no longer stand above him in scholarship, and with a new ambition and energy born of his insult, he soon rose to the highest place in the school. It was not idleness, probably, that made Newton a poor scholar, but his mind was absorbed with making saws, hammers, hatchets, and other tools. He made a windmill and placed it on the top of his home, the wind putting it in motion. When there was no wind, a novel expedient was resorted to. A mouse, which was called the miller, was trained to turn the windmill by walking on a tread wheel with some corn just beyond his reach. All through life he was exceedingly kind to animals and could never tolerate shooting or hunting for sport. He objected to one of his nephews when praised in his presence that he loved killing of birds, and this was sufficient to win his disesteem. It is probable, therefore, that the little mouse was kindly cared for by the young experimenter. He also made a water clock about 4 feet high with a dial plate at the top with figures of the hours. The index was turned by a piece of wood, which either fell or rose by water dropping. Every morning the lad supplied his clock with the proper amount of water. Besides these, he invented a 4-wheeled carriage which was moved with a handle by the person who sat in it. For his boy friends, he made lanterns of crimpled paper with a candle inside to light them to school in the dark winter mornings, and paper kites of the best form and proportion. In dark nights he tied the lanterns to the tails of his kites, and ignorant people sometimes mistook them for comets. On the manor house at Woolsthorpe he carved sundials which were visible a century later. He was a sober, silent, and thinking lad, who was always hammering in his room or making drawings with his pen and pencil, designing with charcoal on his walls birds, animals, ships, and mathematical diagrams. Mrs. Newton, the mother, had married again after a singular courtship. Mr. Smith, a neighbouring clergyman who had a very good estate, had lived a bachelor till he was pretty old, and, one of his parishioners advising him to marry, he said he did not know where to meet with a good wife. The man answered, "The widow Newton is an extraordinary good woman." "But," said Mr. Smith, "how do I know she will have me? And I don't care to ask and be denied. But if you will go and ask her, I will pay you for your day's work." He went accordingly. Her answer was, she would be advised by her brother Ayscough, upon which Mr. Smith sent the same person to Mr. Ayscough on the same errand, who, upon consulting with his sister, treated with Mr. Smith, who gave her son Isaac a parcel of land, one of the terms insisted upon by the widow if she married him. Though for a time she was thus removed from Isaac, leaving him with his grandmother, on the death of Reverend Mr. Smith she returned to the manor house. When Isaac had reached his 15th year, his mother, not seeming to think of any profession for her mechanical son, decided to make of him a farmer and grazier. On Saturdays, the market day at Grantham, she would send him with grain and other agricultural produce in the care of an old and trusty servant. The boy had no taste for selling produce, and would hasten to the attic in the house of Mr. Clark, an apothecary, with whom he had boarded while at school, and there spend his hours in reading old books till the time came for him to go home, the servant meantime having sold the vegetables. Sometimes, however, the lad would not go as far as Grantham, but, seating himself beside a hedge along the road, would read some favourite author till the servant returned. When his mother sent him to watch the cattle, they enjoyed a neighbour's cornfield, while he enjoyed a book or whittled out water wheels. It did not seem intentional disobedience toward a mother of whom he was very fond, but complete absorption in some other pursuit. When he was 16, he was greatly interested in finding the proper form of a body which would offer the least resistance when moving in a fluid. In a severe storm, to test the force of the gale, he jumped first in the direction in which the wind blew, and then in opposition to the wind, and after measuring the length of the leap in both directions, and comparing it with the length to which he could jump in a perfectly calm day, he was enabled to compute the force of the storm. His mother soon found that her boy would not make a successful farmer and sent him back to school at Grantham to prepare for Trinity College, Cambridge, which he entered when he was 19. It is probable that the time spent at Grantham was a happy time, for young Newton there met and, it is said, loved Miss Story, sister of Dr. Story, a physician near Colsterworth and daughter of the apothecary's second wife. She was 2 or 3 years younger than Newton, a girl of attractive face and unusual talents. As his income as a fellow was small after leaving college, they did not marry, though his interest in her continued unabated through life. Though she was twice married, he never paid a visit to Woolsthorpe without going to see her, and liberally relieved her from little pecuniary embarrassments when his own circumstances had become easy. How the world loves constancy, an affection which knows no change. That he would have been happier in those quiet years of study, even in his poverty, had he married, is probable, but that the world gained by his undivided devotion to science is equally probable. On July 8, 1661, Newton entered college and soon, through the study of Descartes' geometry, showed his skill in higher mathematics, and now began an almost unexampled development of mind. At 22, he was studying a comet so closely and the circles and halo around the moon that he impaired his health by sitting up late at night. In 1665, May 20, when he was 23, he committed to writing his first discovery of fluxions, the infinitely small increase or decrease of a variable or flowing quantity in a certain infinitely small and constant period of time. The same year, when the college had been dismissed on account of the plague in Cambridge, Newton made his immortal discovery of the attraction of gravitation. While sitting alone in his garden at Woolsthorpe and observing an apple fall to the ground, it occurred to him that as the same power by which the apple fell was not sensibly diminished at the summits of the loftiest spires, nor on the tops of the highest mountains, it might extend to the moon, about which he had been studying, and retain her in her orbit. If to the moon, why not to the planets? The tree from which the apple fell was so much decayed in 1820 that it was cut down, but the wood was carefully preserved by Mr. Turner of Stoke Rochford. In the beginning of the following year, 1666, when Newton was 24, he purchased a prism in order to make some experiments on Descartes' theory of colours. He made a hole in his window shutter, darkened the room, and admitted a ray of the sunlight. On the opposite wall he saw the solar or prismatic spectrum, an elongated image of the sun about 5 times as long as it was broad, and consisting of 7 different colours: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. White light was thus discovered to be of a compound nature, a mixture of all the colours. He said, "Whiteness is the usual colour of light, for light is a confused aggregate of rays endued with all sorts of colours, as they are promiscuously darted from the various parts of luminous bodies. If any one colour predominates, the light will incline to that colour, as the yellow flame of a candle." Heretofore there had been all sorts of conjectures about the nature and origin of colours. Descartes believed them to be modification of light, depending on the direct or rotary motion of its particles, but Newton showed by many experiments that colour is a property of light, or innate in light itself. We speak of a thing as red because it reflects red and absorbs all the other colours. The green leaf stops or absorbs the red, blue, and violet rays of the white light, and reflects and transmits only those which compose its green. He also found that the red rays are refracted or turned out of their course least of all the colours, and violet most, thereby discovering the different refrangibility of the rays of light, a discovery which has had the most extensive applications to every branch of science and, what is very rare in the history of inventions, one to which no other person has made the slightest claim. His beautiful experiments with rings resulted in his scale of colours of great value in optical research. In 1668, when Newton was 26, he constructed a small reflecting telescope, and soon a larger one, which he sent to the Royal Society, and was made a member of that body in 1671. 2 years previously he had been appointed to the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at Cambridge. He was now, at 27, spoken of as a man of unparalleled genius. He had discovered the compound nature of white light, the attraction of gravity, fluxions, and made the first reflecting telescope ever directed toward the heavens, though one had been invented previously by James Gregory of Aberdeen. The boy who had thought of a mouse to turn his windmill had thought out some of the sublimest things in nature, and was henceforward to rank as one of the few masterminds of science. Newton's doctrine of colours met with the most bitter opposition. At last he became so tired of the controversy that he wrote Leibniz, "I was so persecuted with discussions arising out of my theory of light that I blamed my own imprudence for parting with so substantial a blessing as my quiet to run after a shadow." To another he wrote, "I see I have made myself a slave to philosophy, but if I get free of Mr. Linus's business, I will resolutely bid adieu to it eternally, excepting what I do for my private satisfaction, or leave to come out after me. For I see a man must either resolve to put out nothing new, or to become a slave to defend it." Newton was also troubled pecuniarily at this time, and asked to be excused from the weekly payment to the Royal Society, thereby resigning his membership. He even meditated the study of law, as his income was so limited. Strange that so many of the great things of this life are wrought by those who are in sorrow or privation. But amid all the opposition to his discoveries and his poverty, the unparalleled devotion to study was continued. When he was weary of other branches, he said he refreshed himself with history and chronology. Years afterward he published the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, to which is prefixed a short chronicle from the first memory of things in Europe to the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. Says a gentleman who was with him for years, "I never knew him to take any recreation or pastime, either in riding out to take the air, walking, boating, or any other exercise whatever. Thinking all hours lost that were not spent in his studies, to which he kept so close that he seldom left his chamber except at term time, when he read in the schools, as being Lucasianus professor, where so few went to hear him, and fewer that understood him, that oftentimes he did in a manner, for want of hearers, read to the walls." So intent, so serious upon his studies, that he ate very sparingly, nay, oftentimes he has forgot to eat at all, so that, going into his chamber, I have found his mess untouched, of which when I have reminded him, he would reply, "Have I?" And then, making to the table, he would eat a bit or two standing, for I cannot say I ever saw him sit at table by himself. At some seldom entertainments, the masters of colleges were chiefly his guests. He very rarely went to bed till 2 or 3 of the clock, sometimes not till 5 or 6, lying about 4 or 5 hours, especially at spring and fall of the leaf, at which times he used to employ about 6 weeks in his elaboratory, the fire scarcely going out either night or day, he sitting up one night and I another, till he had finished his chemical experiments, in the performances of which he was the most accurate, strict, exact. When his most intense studies were carried on, he learned to go to bed at 12, finding by experience that if he exceeded that hour by a little, it did him more harm in his health than a whole day's study. He very rarely went to dine in the hall, except on some public days, and then, if he has not been minded, would go very carelessly, with shoes down at heels, stockings untied, surplice on, and his head scarcely combed. At some seldom times when he designed to eat in the hall, he would turn to the left hand and go out into the street. When making a stop when he found his mistake, would hastily turn back, and then, sometimes, instead of going into the hall, would return to his chamber again. In his chamber he walked so very much that you might have thought him to be educated at Athens among the Aristotelian sect. So absent-minded was he, the story is told of him that, going home to Colsterworth, he led his horse up a hill. When he designed to remount, the animal had slipped the bridle and gone away unperceived, though Newton held the bridle in his hand all the time. He would often sit down on his bedside after he rose and remain there for hours without dressing, so completely absorbed was he in his thought. How few in all this world have been so devoted to science, and yet how many expect success without this devotion. The same gentleman writes of Newton, "His carriage was very meek, sedate, and humble, never seemingly angry, of profound thought, his countenance mild, pleasant, and comely. I cannot say I ever saw him laugh but once." In 1687, when Newton was 45, his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica was published. The Principia consists of 3 books. The first book, besides the definition and axioms or laws of motion with which it begins, consists of 14 sections, in the first of which the author explains the method of prime and ultimate ratios used in his investigations, and which is similar to the method of fluxions. The other sections treat of centripetal forces and motions in fixed and movable orbits. The second book consists of 9 sections and treats of bodies moving in resisting media or oscillating as pendulums. The third book consists of 5 sections on the causes of the system of the world, on the quantity of lunar errors, on the quantity of the tides, on the precession of the equinoxes, and on comets. The great principle of the Principia is universal gravitation, that every particle of matter in the universe is attracted by or gravitates to every other particle of matter, with a force inversely proportional to the squares of their distances. By the laws of gravity, Newton was enabled to calculate the quantity of matter in the Sun and in all the planets, and even to determine their density, results which Adam Smith said were above the reach of human reason and experience. He ascertained that the weight of the same body would be 23 times greater at the surface of the Sun than at the surface of the Earth, and that the density of the Earth was 4 times greater than that of the Sun. He found the true figure of the Earth. He explained the phenomena of the tides. Of the Principia, Sir David Brewster says in his able Life of Sir Isaac Newton, it is a work which will be memorable not only in the annals of one science or of one country, but which will form an epoch in the history of the world, and will ever be regarded as the brightest page in the records of human reason. A work, may we not add, which would be read with delight in every planet of our system, in every system of the universe. What a glorious privilege was it to have been the author of the Principia. There was but one earth upon whose form and tides and movements the philosopher could exercise his genius, one moon whose perturbations and inequalities and actions he could study, one sun whose controlling force and apparent motions he could calculate and determine, one system of planets whose mutual disturbances could tax his highest reason, one system of comets whose eccentric paths he could explore and rectify, and one universe of stars to whose binary and multiple combinations he could extend the law of terrestrial gravity. To have been chosen sage, summoned to the study of that earth, these systems and that universe, the favoured lawgiver to worlds unnumbered, the high priest in the temple of boundless space, was a privilege that could be granted but one member of the human family, and to have executed the last was an achievement which, in its magnitude, can be measured only by the infinite in space, and in the duration of its triumphs by the infinite in time. That sage, that lawgiver, that high priest was Newton. The Principia created the greatest interest throughout Europe, but met with violent opposition. While Laplace said it would take preeminence above all the other productions of human genius, the majority could not believe that great planets were suspended in empty space and retained their orbits by an invisible power in the sun. When Newton presented copies to the heads of colleges, some of them, Dr. Babington of Trinity among the number, said they might study 7 years before they understood anything of it. In 1687, Newton's method of fluxions was first published 20 years after its invention, and then because the friends of Leibniz, the author of the differential calculus, claimed priority of discovery. The quarrel aroused the scientific world, embittered the silent mathematician, and impaired his health. In 1689, when he was 47, he was chosen Member of Parliament and represented Cambridge University in the House of Commons for 13 months. He took no active part in the debates, but was, of course, respected for his wonderful mind. This same year, his beloved mother died. Anxiously he had watched through whole nights by her bedside, seeking in all ways to keep her from leaving him alone in the world. He was now nearly 50. His life had been laborious with an insufficient income. His friends, John Locke among the number, tried to obtain various positions for him, but failed. They recommended him for provost of King's College, but the position could not be obtained because he had not taken priest's orders. Seemingly unappreciated, worn out with his incessant brain work, his appetite failing and unable to sleep, with neither mother nor wife to comfort him, the sensitive organization of the great man became overstrained, and mind and body were unfitted for work. It is stated that his ill health was in part consequent upon the burning of some manuscripts on optics by a lighted candle on the table among his papers. When he was 53, the long, hard road of poverty turned into a highway of plenty through the influence of a friend. Charles Montague, an associate of Newton at the university and also in Parliament, though 19 years his junior, intellectual affinities are uninfluenced by age, had been made Commissioner of the Treasury, then Privy Councillor, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and later still Baron of Halifax. Lord Halifax appointed Newton to be Warden of the Mint, and then Master, with an income of between $6,000 and $7,500 annually, which position he held for the remainder of his life. His home in London, where he kept 6 servants with his brilliant niece, Miss Catherine Barton, for his companion, became a place of rest and comfort to the tired philosopher. Lord Halifax was a great admirer of Newton's niece, Miss Catherine Barton, to whom he left at his death a beautiful home and $25,000 as a token of the sincere love, affection, and esteem I have long had for her person, and as a small recompense for the pleasure and happiness I have had in her conversation. The days of privation were over, and Newton had earned this rest and prosperity. Great people often came to dine with him. At one of these dinners, Newton proposed to drink not to the health of kings and princes, but to all honest persons, to whatever country they belonged. "We are all friends," he added, "because we unanimously aim at the only object worthy of man, which is the knowledge of truth. We are also of the same religion, because, leading a simple life, we conform ourselves to what is right, and we endeavor sincerely to give to the Supreme Being that worship which, according to our feeble lights, we are persuaded will please him most." Other honors now came to Newton. In 1703 he was elected President of the Royal Society and was annually re-elected during the remaining 25 years of his life. On April 16, 1705, when he was 63, Queen Anne conferred the honour of knighthood upon her most illustrious subject, Sir Isaac Newton, before a distinguished company at Cambridge University. In 1704, the year previous, his great work on optics had been published, written over 20 years before. About this time, it seems that the great philosopher would have liked to marry Lady Norris, the widow of Sir William Norris, Baronet of Speke and Member of Parliament. Sent to Delhi as ambassador to the Great Mogul, he died in 1702 between Mauritius and St. Helena on his homeward passage. He was the third husband to Lady Norris, and Sir Isaac, now over 60, desired to be the fourth, as appears from the following letter. Madam, your ladyship's great grief at the loss of Sir William shows that if he had returned safe home, your ladyship could have been glad to have lived still with a husband, and therefore your aversion at present from marrying again can proceed from nothing else than the memory of him whom you have lost. To be always thinking on the dead is to live a melancholy life among sepulchres, and how much grief is an enemy to your health is very manifest by the sickness it brought when you received the first news of your widowhood. And can your ladyship resolve to spend the rest of your days in grief and sickness? Can you resolve to wear a widow's habit perpetually, a habit which is less acceptable to company, a habit which will be always putting you in mind of your lost husband, and thereby promote you grief and indisposition till you leave it off? The proper remedy for all these mischiefs is a new husband, and whether your ladyship should admit of a proper remedy for such maladies is a question which I hope will not need much time to consider of. Whether your ladyship should go constantly in the melancholy dress of a widow, or flourish once more among the ladies, whether you should spend the rest of your days cheerfully, or in sadness, in health or in sickness, are questions which need not much consideration to decide them. Besides that your ladyship will be better able to live according to your quality by the assistance of a husband than upon your own estate alone, and therefore, since your ladyship likes the person proposed, I doubt not but in a little time to have notice of your ladyship's inclinations to marry. At least that you will give him leave to discourse with you about it. I am, madam, your ladyship's most humble and most obedient servant. If Lady Norris liked the person proposed as Sir Isaac imagined, a marriage was not the result. It is just possible that he was like Leibniz, who proposed to a lady when he was 50. The lady asked for more time to take the matter into consideration, and as Leibniz thus obtained leisure to consider the matter again, he was never married. For 13 years, Sir Isaac lived on Jermyn Street, London, then moved to Chelsea, a place dear to those who love George Eliot or admire Carlyle, and then to Martin Street, near Leicester Fields. In his latter years he wrote much on theological subjects, especially to prove the existence of a deity. When he was 83, he published a third edition of the Principia. At 85, he read manuscript without spectacles. He reasoned as acutely as ever, his memory alone failing. On March 2nd, 1727, he presided at a meeting of the Royal Society. He was taken ill on the following day, and, although a great sufferer for several days, never uttered a complaint. He died on Monday, March 20, and his body was laid in the Jerusalem chamber, and thence conveyed to Westminster Abbey for burial. The pall was supported by the Lord High Chancellor and several dukes and earls. On the front of his monument are sculptured youths bearing in their hands emblematic designs of Newton's principal discoveries. One carries a prism, another a reflecting telescope, a third is weighing the sun and planets with a steelyard, a fourth is employed about a furnace, and two others are loaded with money newly coined. The monument bears this inscription: Here lies Sir Isaac Newton, Knight, who by a vigor of mind almost supernatural first demonstrated the motions and figures of the planets, the paths of the comets, and the tides of the ocean. He diligently investigated the different refrangibilities of the rays of light and the properties of the colors to which they give rise. An assiduous, sagacious, and faithful interpreter of nature, antiquity, and the Holy Scriptures, he asserted in his philosophy the majesty of God, and exhibited in his conduct the simplicity of the gospel. Let mortals rejoice that there has existed such and so great an ornament of the human race. Born 25 December 1642, died 20 March 1727. A beautiful full-length white marble statue of Sir Isaac was erected in the ante-chapel of Trinity College, where he had done his wonderful work when scarcely more than a boy. While he gave generously during his life, he said, "They who give nothing till they die never give at all." He left a personal estate of $160,000 to be divided among his nephews and nieces. The world honored him at last, and has through all the years. Bishop Burnet said, "Newton had the whitest soul he ever knew. His habits were of the best. When asked to take snuff or tobacco, he declined, saying he would make no necessities to himself. He was modest to the last, saying that whatever service he had done the public was not owing to any extraordinary sagacity, but solely to industry and patient thought." He said a short time before his death, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Sir Charles Lyell. Galileo studied and found out the truth that the earth moves around the sun, and died recanting it. Buffon, the great French naturalist, studied and ascertained that the earth has been subject to changes which must have required millions of years. He wrote, "The waters of the sea have produced the mountains and valleys of the land. The waters of the heavens, reducing all to a level, will at last deliver the whole land over to the sea, and the sea, successively prevailing over the land, will leave dry new continents like those which we inhabit." He was at once summoned before the Faculty of Theology in Paris to recant his opinions, saying, "I declare that I had no intention to contradict the text of Scripture, that I believe most firmly all therein related about the creation, both as to order of time and matter of fact. I abandon everything in my book respecting the formation of the earth and, generally, all which may be contrary to the narration of Moses." A little more than a century later, at Kinnordy, Forfarshire, Scotland, a boy was born, Charles Lyell, who was destined not only to make geology as fascinating to the world as a novel, but to prove more fully and conclusively than anyone had previously done that the world is not only 6,000 years old, but perhaps 6,000 million years old, and that man has lived here not for a few centuries only, but for thousands of centuries. Lyell knew and felt what the Christian world has come to feel, that truth must and will stand, and that there is no real conflict between science and religion. Charles Lyell, the eldest of 10 children, having 2 brothers and 7 sisters, was born November 14, 1797. He had the early training of an educated and refined father, a man who had devoted himself to the study of botany and written several works on Dante. The mother was a woman of practical common sense, and from her, doubtless, Charles inherited that good judgment which characterized all his work and life. At 7, the child was sent to Ringwood, to a school kept by Reverend R.S. Davies. Here, being the youngest and one of the gentlest, he was spared the roughness too often found in boys' schools. At 10, he and his brother Tom were sent to a school in Salisbury, 16 miles from Bartley Lodge, whither the family had moved from Kinnordy. Though they missed their favourite sport of haymaking, they enjoyed walks to Old Sarum, a famous camp of Roman times. Here the boys amused themselves by heaping up piles of chalk flints on the opposite ridges and letting them roll down and dash against each other like two armies. The teacher, Dr. Radcliffe, was called Bluebeard from having his fourth wife. The boys, however, liked him because he had the rare merit of being impartial, while they were never tired of annoying another teacher who had his favourites. Says Lyell of these early days, Monsieur Borel's room was within one in which I and 8 others slept. One night, when we were very angry with him for having spattered us all round with a ruler for a noise in the schoolroom which only one had made and no one would confess, we determined to be revenged. We balanced a great weight of heavy volumes on the top of the door so that no one could open it without their falling on his head. He was caught like a mouse in a trap and threw a book in a rage at each boy's head as they lay shamming sound sleep. Another stratagem of mine and young Prescott, son of Sir G.P., was to tie a string across the room from the legs of 2 beds so as to trip him up. From this string others branched off, the ends of which were fixed to the great toes of 2 sound sleepers, so that when Monsieur drew the lines, they woke, making a great outcry. At last we wearied him out, and he went and slept elsewhere. I conclude that there were far too many hours allotted to sleep at this school, for at all others we were glad to sleep after the labours of the day and got punished for late rising in the morning and being too late for roll call. Here, on the contrary, a great many of our best sports were at night, particularly one which, as very unique and one which lasted all the time I was there, I must describe. It consisted of fighting, either in single combat or whole rooms against others, with bolsters. These were shaken until all the contents were at one end, and then they were kept there by a girth of string or stockings. This made a formidable weapon, the empty end being the handle, and the ball at the other end would hit a good blow, or coil round a fellow's leg and by a jerk pull him up so that he fell backwards. The invading party were always to station a watch at the head of the stairs to give notice of the approach of Bluebeard, for he was particularly severe against this warfare, though he never succeeded in putting it down. He used to come up with a cane, which, as none of us were clothed, took dire effect on those caught out of bed. He had a fortunate twist in his left foot, which made his step recognizable at a distance, and his shoe to creak loudly. This offence was high treason, not only because it led to broken heads and made a horrible row in the night, but because Mrs. Radcliffe found that it made her bolsters wear out most rapidly. Charles grew ill at Salisbury and was taken home for 3 months. I began, he says, to get annoyed with ennui, which did not improve my health, for I was always most exceedingly miserable if unemployed, though I had an excessive aversion to work unless forced to it. It happened that, a little before this time, my father had for a short time exchanged botany for entomology, a fit which only lasted just long enough to induce him to purchase some books on the latter subject, after which he threw it up, principally, I believe, from a dislike to kill the insects. I did not like this department of the subject either. Collecting insects was just the sort of desultory occupation which suited me at the time, as it gave sufficient employment to my mind and body, was full of variety, and to see a store continually increasing gratified what, in the cant phrase of the phrenologist, is termed the accumulative propensity. I soon began to know what was rare and to appreciate specimens by this test. In the evenings I used to look over Donovan's Insects, a work in which a great number of the British species are well given in coloured plates, but which has no scientific merit. This was a royal road of arriving at the names and required no study, but mere looking at pictures. At first I confined my attention to the Lepidoptera, butterflies, moths, etc., as the most beautiful, but soon became fond of watching the singular habits of the aquatic insects, and used to sit whole mornings by a pond, feeding them with flies and catching them if I could. I had no companion to share this hobby with me, no one to encourage me in following it up, yet my love for it continued always to increase, and it afforded a most varied source of amusement. Instead of sympathy, I received from almost everyone else beyond my home either ridicule or hints that the pursuit of other boys were more manly. The disrepute in which my hobby was held had a considerable effect upon my character, for I was very sensitive of the good opinions of others, and therefore followed it up almost by stealth, so that, although I never confessed to myself that I was wrong, but always reasoned myself into a belief that the generality of people were too stupid to comprehend the interest of such pursuits. Yet I got too much in the habit of avoiding being seen, as if I was ashamed of what I did. The temporary ill health of the schoolboy led to the long hours of observation of nature. These led to a devotion to science, which brought a worldwide fame. Thus, often, that which seems a hindrance in life proves a blessing in the end. At 12, Charles was placed in a school where there were 70 boys, with much fagging and fighting. That this roughness was not in accordance with his noble and refined nature is shown by his words years afterwards. Whatever some may say or sing of the happy recollections of their school days, I believe the generality, if they told the truth, would not like to have them over again, or would consider them as less happy than those which follow. The recollection of it makes me bless my stars I have not to go through it again. My ambition, he says, during the second half-year was excited by finding myself rising near the top of a class of 15 boys in which I was, and, when miserable, as I often was, with the kicks and cuffs I received, I got into a useful habit of thinking myself happy when I got a high number in the class paper. Each year he received a prize for speaking, and often prizes for Latin and English original composition. At 17, young Lyell entered Exeter College, Oxford. He still devoted many hours to entomology and took some honours in classics. A book, as is often the case, had already helped to shape his life. He had found and read in his father's library Bakewell's Geology, and was greatly excited over the views there expressed about the antiquity of the earth. Dr. Buckland, professor of geology at Oxford, was then at the height of his fame, and Lyell at once attended a course of his lectures and took notes. College life was having its influence over the youth, for he wrote to his father, "It is the seeing the superiority of others that convinces one how much is to be and must be done to get any fame. And it is this which spurs the emulation and feeds that atmosphere of learning which Sir Joshua Reynolds admirably describes as floating round all public institutions, and which even the idle often breathe in and then wonder how they came by it." And yet Lyell, like most students, found it a difficult matter to decide what was best for a life pursuit. His father wished him to study law. In reply the son says, "As for the confidence and quickness which you were speaking of, as one of the chief requisites of the bar, I don't know whether intercourse with the world will supply it, but God knows I have little enough of it now in company." During his college course, Lyell made a journey with some friends to Staffa and wrote a poem upon the place, and then, with his parents and eldest sisters, travelled in France, Switzerland, and Italy. Here, in the midst of art and beautiful scenery, his mind still turned toward science. He thought the collections in comparative anatomy in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris would tempt anyone to take up ardently the study of anatomy. In Cuvier's lecture room, filled with fossil remains, he found 3 glorious relics of a former world which have added several new genera to the mammalia. In the Jura chain, he concluded the limestone to be of a different age from what we passed through before Dijon, for the later abounded in organic remains, whereas I could not discover one fossil in the Jura. By the roadside I picked up many beautiful petrifications which must be forming daily here, where the water is charged plentifully with lime. The rock of the Col de Balme, he said, is a brown, ligneous slate, with some veins of white quartz intersecting it. The appearance is very curious. On the top was the richest carpet of turf I ever saw, spangled with thousands of deep blue gentian, red trefoil, and other mountain flowers. Nothing said about law, but much about rocks. At 22, Lyell graduated from Oxford. The same year he became a Fellow of the Geological Society of London and also of the Linnean Society, and in accordance with his father's preference, began the study of law in London. But the way to success is almost never easy. Lyell's eyes became very weak, and he was obliged to desist from reading and go to Rome with his father. Many a young man, well-to-do, would have given up a profession, preferring a life of leisure. Not so Charles Lyell. On his return he inspected Romney Marsh, an extensive tract of land formerly covered by the sea, and also the Isle of Wight, and wrote his first scientific paper on the geology of some rivers near his native place of Forfarshire. At 26 he was made Secretary of the Geological Society. Already such men as Dr. Buckland felt the deepest interest in the enterprising young student who was devoting himself to original research. And now he was going to Paris to perfect himself in French. Dr. Buckland and others gave him letters of introduction to such persons as Humboldt and Cuvier. Fortunate young Lyell. Such men would fan the flame of aspiration to a white heat. Once in Paris, the stimulus of great minds did its accustomed work, developed and beautified another mind. He attended a levee at Alexander Brongniart's, who among the English geologists has the highest reputation both for knowledge and agreeable manners of all the French savants, he wrote home to his father. Again he wrote, "My reception at Cuvier's last Saturday will make me feel myself at liberty to attend his soirees next week, and they are a great treat. He was very polite and invited me to attend the Institute on Monday. There he introduced me to several geologists and put me in an excellent place for hearing. Humboldt addressed me as Duval had done, with, 'I have the honor of being familiar with your name, as your father has labored with no small success in botany, particularly the cryptogamiae.' He was not a little interested in hearing me detail the critiques which our geologists have made on his last geological work, a work which would give him a rank in science if he had never published aught besides. He made me a present of his work, and I was surprised to find how much he has investigated the details of our English strata. He appears to work hard at astronomy and lives in a garret for the sake of that study. The King of Prussia invited him to adorn his court at the last Congress. Thence he went to Vesuvius just after the grand eruption, and brought away much geological information on that head, which he was good enough to communicate to me. He speaks English well. I attend lectures at the Jardin du Roi on mining, geology, chemistry, and zoology, all gratis, by the first men. I have promised Humboldt to pass the afternoon today in his study. His new edition serves as a famous lesson to me in the comparison of England and the continent. There are few heroes who lose so little by being approached as Humboldt. Who shall estimate the value of such a friendship to a young man? It was a foregone conclusion that Lyell and Agassiz and Liebing and others who sought the society of such as Humboldt and were willing to work would come to greatness. Cuvier introduced Lyell to Professor van Breda of Ghent, who gave him letters to all the Dutch universities, Ghent, Amsterdam, Haarlem and Leyden. The next year, 1824, Lyell made a geological tour with Monsieur Constant Prévost, a noted French geologist, from London to Bristol and Land's End, and with Dr. Buckland in Scotland, where they dined with the far-famed Francis Jeffrey, editor of the Edinburgh Review. Lyell's eyes still troubled him so that he could scarcely write letters home, but he was laying up a store of knowledge from which the world was to profit in a few years. In 1825, his eyes having improved, he resumed his law study and was admitted to the bar. But he could not give up geological work and published several papers, one on a dike of serpentine, another on shell marl and fossil fruit, and others on plastic clay in Hampshire and the freshwater strata of Hants. He had been made a Fellow of the Royal Society at 29 and was one of the writers in the Quarterly Review. The law work went on, but it was easy to see where his heart was. He wrote a friend that he had been devouring Lamarck. That the earth is quite as old as he supposes has long been my creed, and I will try before 6 months are over to convert the readers of the Quarterly to that heterodox opinion. Buckland has got a letter from India about modern hyenas, whose manners, habitations, diet, etc. are everything he could wish, and as much as could be expected had they attended regularly 3 courses of his lectures. At 31, Lyell had made up his mind that there is most real independence in that class of society who, possessing moderate means, are engaged in literary and scientific hobbies. He had given up the law and planned the book that was to make him famous, Principles of Geology. He travelled now extensively in Italy and France, studying volcanoes, glaciers, and fossils. At Auvergne he began work with his dear friend Murchison at 6 o'clock in the morning, and neither heat nor fatigue has stopped us an hour, he writes to his parents. I have really gained strength so much that I believe that I and my eyes were never in such a condition before, and I am sure that 6 hours in bed, which is all we allow, and exercise all day long for the body, and geology for the mind, is the best thing that can be invented in this world for my health and happiness. 18 hours of labour daily, and yet he was happy. He had found his life work now. To a sister he writes about the beetles of Eye. He cannot be laughed out of this study as when a boy. He has been to Parma to see Professor Guidotti's finest collection of fossil shells in Italy, spending 3 days from 6 o'clock in the morning till night exchanging our respective commodities. To his sisters he writes all his discoveries in rocks and fossils with the enthusiasm of a boy. I rode to the upper Val d'Arno, a famous day for me, an old lacustrine deposit corresponding delightfully with our Angus lakes in all but age and species of animals, same genera of shells. They have just extracted the 40th skeleton of hippopotamus, have got about 20 elephants, 1 or 2 mastodons, a rhinoceros and stags, and oxen out of number. At Rome I found the geology of the city itself exceedingly interesting. The celebrated 7 hills, of which you have read, and which in fact are 9, are caused by the Tiber and some tributaries which have cut open valleys almost entirely through volcanic ejected matter, covered by travertine containing lacustrine shells. He made the ascent of Etna and sketched the crater. Inside the crater, near the lip, were huge masses of ice, between which and the scoria and lava of the crater issued hot sulphurous vapours which I breathed in copiously, and for 6 hours after I could not, even after eating and drinking, get the horrid taste out of my mouth, for my lungs had got full of it. The wind was so high that the guide held my hat while I drew, but though the head was cold, my feet got so hot in the cinders that I was often alarmed that my boots would be burnt. In 1830, the first volume of Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation, was published. It will not pretend, he wrote to Murchison, to give even an abstract of all that is known in geology, but it will endeavour to establish the principles of reasoning in the science, and all my geology will come in as illustration of my views of those principles, and as evidence strengthening the system necessarily arising out of the admission of such principles, which, as you know, are neither more nor less than that no causes whatever have from the earliest time to which we can look back to the present ever acted but those now acting. I must go to Germany. Their language must be learnt, the places to which their memoirs relate visited, and then you may see, as I may, to what extent we may indulge dreams of eminence, at least as original observers. He too, like all the other great ones, indulged in dreams of eminence. Did ever man or woman achieve anything worthy without these dreams? He had worked earnestly upon the principles which showed wonderful research, study, and thought. He said, "The facts which are given in a few sentences require weeks of reading to obtain. By the aid of a good amanuensis, my eyes hold out well." The sale of the book was large and satisfactory. It was, of course, opposed from its advanced views as to the age of the world, but Lyell wisely made no reply. He said, "I have sworn to myself that I will not go to the expense of giving time to combat in controversy. It is an interminable work. A great lesson learned early." In 1831 he visited Germany. Now he wrote home not only to his family, but to another, who was hereafter to brighten and beautify his life, Mary Horner, the daughter of a prominent scientist. To great personal beauty she added unusual mental ability. Wise man indeed was Charles Lyell to have known what some failed to know beforehand, that intellect demands intellect for the best companionship. He wrote to her, "I am sure you will work at it, the German language, with more zeal if you believe you can help me by it, as I labour with greater spirit, now that I regard myself as employed for you as well as for myself. Not that I am at all sanguine about the pecuniary profits that I shall ever reap, but I feel that if I could have fair play for the next 10 years, I could gain a reputation that would make a moderate income for the latter part of my life, yield me a command of society, and a respect that would entitle me to rest a little on my oars and enable me to help somewhat those I love. As to geology having half of my heart, I hope I shall be able to give my whole soul to it, with that enthusiasm by which alone any advance can be made in science, or indeed in any profession." In 1832, Lyell was made Professor of Geology in King's College, London, which position he resigned later because he wished the power of commanding time to increase his knowledge and fame. This year also, July 12, when he was 35, he married to Mary Horner and made a tour up the valley of the Rhine. The earnest life was now more earnest and busy than ever. He said, "I am never so happy as when, at the end of a week, I feel I have employed every day in a manner that will tell to the rest of my life. Would that all of us could live after so noble a plan. Unless I can feel that I am working to some decided end, such as that of fame, money, or partly both, I cannot be quite happy, or cannot feel a stimulus to that strenuous application without which I should not remain content." He had learned what strenuous application means, and knew that there is no success without it. When congratulated by his friends in not looking older for his hard work, he said, "The way to do much and not grow old is to be moderate in not going out, to work a few hours or half hours at a time, and to go to bed at 11 o'clock. He would not accept many invitations socially. A man should have some severity of character and be able to refuse invitations, etc., he said. The fact is that to become great in science, a man must be nearly as devoted as a lawyer, and must have more than mere talent. I think I never do so much as when I have fought a battle not to go out." Those who have written books will appreciate this statement and recall the many days when they have closed the shutters and worked, though they longed to be out of doors in the sunlight. In 1833, the year after his marriage, he gave by invitation a course of 7 lectures before the Royal Institution, a high honour. In 1834, he passed several months in Sweden and wrote back to his dearest Mary, "I have been 10 hours without a word with my love, but thinking of her more than half the time and comforting myself that she is less alone than I am." He kept a journal for her of his daily work. "It is now 25 days that we have been separated, and I have often thought of what you said, that the active occupation in which I should constantly be engaged would give me a great advantage over you. I trust, however, that you also have been actively employed. At leisure moments I have done some things towards planning my next volume. It will be necessary for us to have a work together at Fossils at Kinnordy first, and then in town, and then in Paris." Thus fully had the young wife entered into his studies. In 1835, having received the gold medal of the Royal Society for his Principles of Geology, now in its 4th edition, which Sir John Herschel said he had read 3 times, he was elected President of the Geological Society of London and made extensive researches in Switzerland, Germany, and Scotland. In 1841, already famous as well as beloved, Lyell was invited to give 12 lectures before the Lowell Institute in Boston. He and his wife spent 13 months in the United States studying the country geologically, its social life, its politics, and our benevolent and educational institutions. Between 2,000 and 3,000 persons came, both morning and evening, to listen to the distinguished scholar who had travelled almost the world over to study his beloved science. Close friendships were formed with some of our most prominent men like Prescott and Ticknor. Lyell visited the Great Lakes and compared the supposed ancient boundaries of Lake Ontario when it was 150 feet higher with its present shore. He made a careful study of Niagara Falls, which cuts its deep gorge toward Lake Ontario for 7 miles, and estimated that it wore away a foot a year. If so, he argued that at least 35,000 years have passed since the river began to cut its passage between the high rocky walls. "What would I give," said Lyell, "for a daguerreotype of the scene as it was 4,000 and again 40,000 years ago? Even 4 centuries would have been very important." Authorities differ as to the rate of the recession of the falls. Some estimate an inch instead of a foot yearly, requiring a period of more than 400,000 years. In 1845, Lyell published his Travels in North America with Geological Observations, and in September of the same year returned again to our country, spending 9 months in travel and study, and bringing out later, in 1849, his second visit to the United States of North America. Already his Elements of Geology had appeared, which went through several editions. A 7th edition of the Principles had been published. He had also been knighted by the Queen for his rare scholarship, honoured at home and abroad, working ardently and earnestly, often with failing sight. He had already won for himself the eminence of which he had dared to dream years before. Of course he was welcomed at all great gatherings. Macaulay and Hallam, Milmore and Mrs. Somerville, Rogers and scores of others were often at his home. In 1851 he was appointed one of the Royal Commissioners for the great exhibition held in Hyde Park, London, and a year later gave a second course of lectures at the Lowell Institute, Boston. So kindly and cordially had he written concerning us and our country that he received the heartiest welcome. He had carried out in his life what he wrote to beautiful Mary Horner 20 years before. "I hope we shall both of us contrive to cultivate a disposition which David Hume said was better than a fortune of £1,000 a year, to look on the bright side of things. I think I shall, and I believe you will." The sweet-natured and great-minded man had looked on the bright side of America and seen the good rather than the evil. He believed in our future. When Prescott died, to whom he was devotedly attached, he said, "From such a soil and in such an atmosphere, great literary men must continue to spring up." All through our Civil War he had known and loved us so well that he was, like John Bright, our constant advocate. He deprecated the course of some of the English newspapers. "The integrity of the empire," he said, "and the non-extension and, for the last 2 years, the extinction of slavery constitute, to my mind, better grounds for a protracted struggle than those for which any war in our time, perhaps in all history, has been waged. I am in hopes that the struggle in America will rid the country in the course of 20 years of that great curse to the whites, slave labor, and, if so, it may be worth all it will cost in blood and treasure. Had the states been dismembered, there would have been endless wars, more activity than ever in breeding slaves in America, and a renewal of the African slave trade, and the future course of civilization retarded in that continent in a degree which would not, in my judgment, be counterbalanced by any adequate advantage which Europe would gain by the United States becoming relatively less strong. I believe that if a small number of our statesmen had seen what I had seen of America, they would not have allowed their wishes for dismemberment to have biased their judgment of the issue so much. In 1853, at the request of his government, he came to New York as one of the commissioners to the International Exhibition. Of course, now, wherever he travelled, either in Europe or America, he met the distinguished and was honoured by them. He was the friend of Berzelius, the noted chemist of Sweden, and of the great Liebig of Germany. Professor Bunsen of Heidelberg said that all his taste for geology had been derived from Lyell's books. During the next few years he was much in Holland, France, and Germany, preparing for the publication of another great work in 1863, The Antiquity of Man. He had made a careful study of the ancient Swiss lake dwellings, erected on piles in the midst of the water, connected with the land by bridges. On Lake Neuchâtel it is estimated that there were more than 40 such circular houses. At Wangen, near Stein, on Lake Constance, it is believed 40,000 piles were used. Some 5,000 objects have been found comprising flax, not woven but plaited, carbonized wheat, and the bones of the dog, ox, sheep, and goat. The arrowheads, hatchets, and the like belong to the Stone Age, which geologists place at the least 7,000 years ago. At Zurich, one human skull was found belonging to this early Stone Age. No traveller should pass through Zurich without seeing these memorials of a people who lived in the dawn of civilization, when the world was being made ready for the more perfect man. Lyell had studied also the Danish kitchen middens, familiar to those who have been carefully over the museums at Copenhagen. These shell mounds, the refuse heaps of this ancient race, are sometimes 1,000 feet long and 200 wide. As far back as the time of the Romans, the Danish Isles were covered with magnificent beech forests. In the Bronze Age, there were no beech trees but oaks. In the Stone Age, the Scotch fir prevailed, and thousands of years must have elapsed while these giant forests succeeded each other. The delta and alluvial plain of the Mississippi Lyell found to consist of sediment covering an area of 30,000 square miles, several hundred feet deep. Taking the amount deposited annually, it would require from 50 to 100,000 years to produce the present deposits. The coral reefs of Florida, built up at the rate of 1 foot in a century, each reef adding 10 miles to the coast, have required, according to Agassiz, at least 135,000 years for building. Human remains in a bluff on the shores of Lake Monroe in Florida he shows to be at least 10,000 years old. Under the streets of Glasgow, Scotland, 17 canoes have been dug up. one in a vertical position, as if it had sunk in a storm, with the prow uppermost. 12 canoes 100 yards back from the river were found 19 feet beneath the surface. Almost all were single oak trees, hollowed out by blunt tools, probably stone axes aided by fire, relics of the Stone Age. In caverns near Liège, France, human bones have been found with the cave bear, elephant, rhinoceros and other species now extinct. Skulls found in these primeval caves, especially one near Düsseldorf called the Neanderthal, is the most brutal of all known human skulls, resembling those of the apes. These rude men probably were living at the same time or even later than the makers of the refuse heaps of Denmark. Wales has been under the sea to the depth of 1,400 feet, as proved by glacial shells. Its submergence and re-elevation would require, by careful computation, about 224,000 years. Lyell showed that the Alps, Andes, and Himalaya mountains were all elaborated underwater. The Alps have acquired 4,000 and even in some places more than 10,000 feet of their present altitude since the commencement of the Eocene, dawn of recent, period. It is not too much to say that every spot which is now dry land has been sea at some former period, and every part of the space now covered by the deepest ocean has been land. The present distribution of land and water encourages us to believe that almost every conceivable transformation in the external form of the Earth's crust may have been gone through. In one epoch, the land may have been chiefly equatorial, in another, for the most part, polar and circumpolar. Lyell also showed the great age of the world by the changes which have taken place in climate. In Greenland are a multitude of fossil plants which show that it formerly enjoyed a mild and genial climate. Fossil tulip and walnut trees have been found within the Arctic Circle. On the North American continent, between the Arctic Circle and the 42nd parallel of latitude, said Lyell, we meet with signs of ice action on a scale as grand, if not grander, than in Europe. The drift covered from the Atlantic border of New England and Labrador westward to Dakota and Lake Winnipeg, and farther north across the continent. Some stones in this bed of ice were 30 feet square, weighing over 4 million pounds. Some boulders from the Alps, weighing 3,000 tons each, are now found on the Juras. It must, I think, said Lyell, be conceded that the period required for the coming on of the greatest cold and for its duration when most intense, and the oscillations to which it was subject, as well as the retreat of the glaciers and the great thaw or disappearance of snow from many mountain chains where the snow was once perpetual, required not tens but hundreds of thousands of years. In Arctic Siberia, herds of elephants must have roamed, as their bodies covered with hair and flesh have been dug up in recent years. Great Britain and Europe have been much warmer than now. Our own immense coal fields show a former tropical climate, with their great tree ferns and tree rushes, while the remains of reindeers have been found in Connecticut. No wonder Lyell became fascinated with the history of the changes of this planet and the life of man before historic times. A great book seemed open to him, and he studied it by night and by day. The Archean time, no life. Paleozoic time, including the Silurian age with its shells and trilobites, the Devonian with its fishes, Carboniferous with its coal plants, Mesozoic time, including the Reptilian age with its reptiles, Cenozoic time, including the Mammalian or Tertiary with its mammals, and Quaternary or Age of Man. Paleozoic means ancient life, Mesozoic middle life, Cenozoic recent life. Lyell divided the Tertiary strata into 3 groups: Eocene, recent dawn; Miocene, less recent; Pliocene, more recent. In the Eocene age, Great Britain was subtropical, and in North America, Vermont was like North Carolina in temperature. Then came the glacial period with ice probably 5,000 feet thick over New England. Then the Champlain period with its floods, continents depressed and climate warm, followed in Europe by a second glacial period. The antiquity of man had an extensive sail. Honours were now showered upon Sir Charles Lyell. He was offered the presidency of the Royal Society and a seat in Parliament for the University of London, but declined both. Oxford University had already conferred upon him the degree of D.C.L., and the Institute of France had made him corresponding member. By request of the Queen, he visited her at Osborne, she having made him a baronet. Emperor William conferred upon him the Order of Merit, given also to Humboldt, and the London Royal Society its highest honour, the Copley Gold Medal. In the spring of 1873, his dearest Mary died, leaving him heartbroken. She was mourned in America as well as Europe. The Boston Advertiser said, "Strength and sweetness were hers, both in no common measure." She became to her husband not merely the truest of friends and the most affectionate and sympathizing of companions, but a very efficient helper. She was frank, generous, and true. Her moral instincts were high and pure. She was faithful and firm in friendship. This woman so widely informed, so true, so strong, so brave, seemed all compact of softness, sweetness, and gentleness. A very flower that had done no more than drink the sunshine and the dew. In her smile, her greeting, the tones of her voice, there was a charm which cannot be described, but which all who knew her have felt and will recall. During the war there was not a woman or man in England that stood by the Union and the government more ardently and fearlessly than she. Lady Lyell was an efficient linguist and a woman of unusual mental power. The success of her husband was in part the result of her lovely character. Had she sought society while he needed quiet for his work, had she been fond of dress when their income was limited and necessarily used in his extensive travels, his life might have been a failure. They had what Tolstoy well calls the friendship of the soul, identity of sentiment and similarity of ideal. Too often in this world persons marry opposites and walk, alas, in opposite directions all their lives. Lyell now worked on, for he said he must carry out what he had planned with her. In 1872 the 11th edition of the Principles appeared. Lyell, though formerly an opponent, had become convinced of the truth of evolution, advocated by his devoted friend Darwin, and was proud of our own distinguished botanist, Asa Gray, whose articles, he said, were the ablest and, on the whole, grappling with the subject both as a naturalist and metaphysician, better than anyone else on either side of the Atlantic. Lyell believed ever in an infinite and eternal being. He said, "In whatever direction we pursue our researches, whether in time or space, we discover everywhere the clear proofs of a creative intelligence and of his foresight, wisdom, and power." He used to quote Professor Agassiz, who said, "Whenever a new and startling fact is brought to light in science, people first say, 'It is not true,' then that it is contrary to religion, and lastly that everybody knew it before." For the last 10 years of his life, unable to use his eyes to any great extent, Lyell had the assistance as secretary of the able author of The Fairyland of Science, Miss Arabella Buckley, now Mrs. Fisher, and yet he accomplished more than most people with the best of eyes. 2 years after his wife's death, while at work on the 12th edition of the Principles, the end came. February 22, 1875. He was buried in Westminster Abbey beside his friend Sir John Herschel, the Duke of Argyll, Professor Huxley, and other noted men acting as pallbearers. Said the Dean of Westminster in the funeral sermon preached in the Abbey, "He followed truth with a zeal as sanctified as ever fired the soul of a missionary, and with a humility as childlike as ever subdued the mind of a simple scholar. From early youth to extreme old age, it was to him a solemn religious duty to be incessantly learning, constantly growing, fearlessly correcting his own mistakes, always ready to receive and reproduce from others that which he had not in himself. Science and religion, for him, not only were not divorced, but were one and indivisible." Truly, said Tyndall, Huxley, and others, for the last 25 years he has been the most prominent geologist in the world, equally eminent for the extent of his labours and the breadth of his philosophical views. To the last, Sir Charles Lyell kept his affectionate, tender heart, with gentle and kindly manners. He was fair to his opponents and appreciative of all talent. He took time to help others. He urged the name of Agassiz as the lecturer before the Lowell Institute, Boston, and we all know the grand results of his coming. Those who have no time to help others usually fail of help when their own time of need comes. Lyell was singularly free from vanity, egotism, or jealousy. He loved nature devotedly, the grandeur of the sea especially impressing him. He never tired of wandering alone beside it. He had great steadiness of purpose and calm judgment. His perseverance was untiring, his power of work remarkable, his sympathy boundless. He was never narrow or opinionated. He died as he had lived, honored the world over for his amazing knowledge, and loved for his unselfish, earnest, and beautiful character. Charles Robert Darwin. On Wednesday, April 26, 1882, sitting in the north transept of Westminster Abbey, I looked upon a sad and impressive scene. Under the dome stood an oaken coffin quite covered with white wreaths. Close by were seated the distinguished pall-bearers, Sir John Lubbock, Canon Farrar, the Duke of Argyll, Thomas H. Huxley, James Russell Lowell, and others. Representatives of many nations were present. The great scientists of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Russia. Of the thousands who were gathered to honour the famous dead, every person wore black, as requested on the cards of admission to the Abbey. Perhaps never in the history of England have so many noted men been assembled on an occasion like this. As the choir, in their white robes, stood about the open grave singing the Dead March from Saul, the strains seemed to come from a far-off country, producing an effect never to be forgotten. Darwin lies buried close to the graves of Sir Isaac Newton and Sir John Herschel. At Shrewsbury, England, February 12, 1809, Charles Robert Darwin was born in a square red-brick house at the top of a terraced bank leading down to the Severn. The greenhouse, with its varied plants, the ornamental shrubs and trees in the grounds, became a delight as soon as the boy was old enough to observe them. The mother, Susanna, the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood of Etruria, a woman with a sweet and happy face, died when Charles was 8 years old, leaving 5 other children, Marianne, Caroline, Erasmus, Susan, and Catherine. Charles says of her in his autobiography, "It is odd that I can remember hardly anything about her except her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table." She evidently encouraged the boy's love for flowers, for he used to say at school that his mother had taught him how by looking at the inside of the blossom the name of the plant could be discovered. The father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a well-known physician, a man of fine physique and courtly manner who had amassed wealth by his skill and business ability. Charles's admiration of him was unbounded. "The wisest man I ever knew," he used often to say. His chief mental characteristics, said Darwin, were his powers of observation and his sympathy, neither of which have I ever seen exceeded or even equalled. His sympathy was not only with the distresses of others, but in a greater degree with the pleasures of all around him. This led him to be always scheming to give pleasure to others, and, though hating extravagance, to perform many generous actions. For instance, Mr. B, a small manufacturer in Shrewsbury, came to him one day and said he should be bankrupt unless he could at once borrow £10,000, but that he was unable to give any legal security. My father heard his reasons for believing that he could ultimately repay the money, and, from his intuitive perception of character, felt sure that he was to be trusted. So he advanced this sum, which was a very large one for him while young, and was after a time repaid. I suppose that it was his sympathy which gave him unbounded power of winning confidence, and as a consequence made him highly successful as a physician. He began to practice before he was 21 years old, and his fees during the first year paid for the keep of 2 horses and a servant. On the following year his practice was large, and so continued for about 60 years, when he ceased to attend on anyone. His great successes as a doctor were the more remarkable as he told me that he at first hated his profession so much that if he had been sure of the smallest pittance, or if his father had given him any choice, nothing should have induced him to follow it. To the end of his life the thought of an operation almost sickened him, and he could scarcely endure to see a person bled, a horror which he has transmitted to me. Charles went to the day school in Shrewsbury when he was 8 years old. By the time I went to this day school, he says, my taste for natural history and more especially for collecting was well developed. I tried to make out the names of plants and collected all sorts of things, shells, seals, francs, coins, and minerals. The passion for collecting which leads a man to be a systematic naturalist, a virtuoso, or a miser was very strong in me, and was clearly innate, as none of my sisters or brothers ever had this taste. I must have been a very simple little fellow when I first went to school. A boy of the name of Garnet took me into a cake shop one day and bought some cakes, for which he did not pay, as the shopman trusted him. When he came out, I asked him why he did not pay for them, and he instantly answered, "Why, do you not know that my uncle left a great sum of money to the town, on condition that every tradesman should give whatever was wanted without payment to anyone who wore his old hat and moved it in a particular manner?" And he then showed me how it was moved. He then went into another shop where he was trusted and asked for some small article, moving his hat in the proper manner, and of course obtained it without payment. When we came out, he said, "Now, if you like to go by yourself into that cake shop," how well I remember its exact position, "I will lend you my hat, and you can get whatever you like if you move the hat on your head properly." I gladly accepted the generous offer and went in and asked for some cakes, moved the old hat, and was walking out of the shop when the shopman made a rush at me. So I dropped the cakes and ran for dear life, and was astonished by being greeted with shouts of laughter from my false friend Garnet. In the summer of 1818, I went to Dr. Butler's great school in Shrewsbury, and remained there for 7 years till midsummer 1825, when I was 16 years old. I boarded at this school so that I had the great advantage of living the life of a true schoolboy, but as the distance was hardly more than a mile to my home, I very often ran there in the longer intervals between the callings over and before locking up at night. This, I think, was in many ways advantageous to me by keeping up home affections and interests. I remember in the early part of my school life that I often had to run very quickly to be in time, and, from being a fleet runner, was generally successful. But when in doubt, I prayed earnestly to God to help me, and I well remember that I attributed my success to the prayers and not to my quick running, and marvelled at how generally I was aided. I have heard my father and elder sister say that I had, as a very young boy, a strong taste for long, solitary walks, but what I thought about I know not. I often became quite absorbed, and once, whilst returning to school on the summit of the old fortifications round Shrewsbury, which had been converted into a public footpath with no parapet on one side, I walked off and fell to the ground, but the height was only 7 or 8 feet. Nevertheless, the number of thoughts which passed through my mind during this very short but sudden and wholly unexpected fall was astonishing, and seem hardly compatible with what physiologists have, I believe, proved about each thought requiring quite an appreciable amount of time. As Dr. Butler's school was strictly classical, Darwin always felt that, for him, these years were nearly wasted. He read many authors, Shakespeare, Thomson's Seasons, Byron and Scott, but later in life, he says, lost all taste for poetry. This he greatly regretted, and said that if he were to live his life over, he would read some poetry every day. The book that most influenced him was The Wonders of the World, which gave him a desire to travel, which was finally realized in The Voyage of the Beagle. He did not forget his zest in collecting, at first, however, taking only such insects as he found dead, for, after consulting his sister, he concluded that it was not right to kill insects for the sake of making a collection. From reading White's Selborne, I took much pleasure in watching the habits of birds, and even made notes on the subject. In my simplicity, I remember wondering why every gentleman did not become an ornithologist. Towards the close of my school life, my brother worked hard at chemistry and made a fair laboratory, with proper apparatus in the tool house in the garden, and I was allowed to aid him as a servant in most of his experiments. He made all the gases and many compounds, and I read with great care several books on chemistry, such as Henry and Parkes' Chemical Catechism. The subject interested me greatly, and we often used to go on working till rather late at night. This was the best part of my education at school, for it showed me practically the meaning of experimental science. The fact that we worked at chemistry somehow got known at school, and as it was an unprecedented fact, I was nicknamed Gas. When I left the school, I was for my age neither high nor low in it, and I believe that I was considered by all my masters and by my father as a very ordinary boy, rather below the common standard in intellect. To my deep mortification, my father once said to me, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." But my father, who was the kindest man I ever knew and whose memory I love with all my heart, must have been angry and somewhat unjust when he used such words. Dr. Darwin now sent his 2 boys, Erasmus and Charles, to Edinburgh University. Here, Charles found the lectures intolerably dull, all except those on chemistry by Hope. His father, evidently not being able to determine for what his son was best fitted in life, suggested his being a doctor. The youth attended the clinical wards in the hospital, but one day, witnessing 2 operations, one upon a child, he rushed away. He says, "Nor did I attend again, for hardly any inducement would have been strong enough to make me do so, this being long before the blessed days of chloroform. The 2 cases fairly haunted me for many a long year." While in Edinburgh, Charles became deeply interested in marine zoology and read a paper before the Plinian Society, an association organized for the study of natural history. He also attended the meetings of the Venerian Society, where he had heard Audubon deliver some interesting lectures upon the habits of North American birds, and the Royal Society, where he saw Sir Walter Scott in the chair as president. "I looked at him and at the whole scene," says Darwin, "with some awe and reverence, and I think it was owing to this visit during my youth and to my having attended the Royal Medical Society that I felt the honour of being elected a few years ago, an honorary member of both these societies, more than any other similar honour. If I had been told at that time that I should one day have been thus honoured, I declare that I should have thought it as ridiculous and improbable as if I had been told that I should be elected King of England." During this time, Charles met Sir James Mackintosh, the best converser, he says, I ever listened to. I heard afterwards with a glow of pride that he had said, "There is something in that young man that interests me." To hear of praise from an eminent person, though no doubt apt or certain to excite vanity, is, I think, good for a young man, as it helps to keep him in the right course. After 2 years at Edinburgh, Dr. Darwin, seeing that Charles probably would never become a physician, sent him to Cambridge University that he might prepare for the episcopal ministry. Of this time, he says, "The 3 years which I spent at Cambridge were wasted, as far as the academical studies were concerned, as completely as at Edinburgh and at school. I attempted mathematics, and even went during the summer of 1828 with a private tutor, a very dull man, to Barmouth, but I got on very slowly. The work was repugnant to me, chiefly from my not being able to see any meaning in the early steps in algebra. He found great delight in Paley's Evidences of Christianity and his Moral Philosophy." At Cambridge, like Humboldt, he formed a rare friendship which helped towards his subsequent success. Professor Henslow was an ardent scholar, a devoted Christian, and a man of most winning manners and good temper. From his great knowledge of botany, entomology, chemistry, mineralogy, and geology, he became a most attractive person to young Darwin, whose especial passion seemed to be the collecting of beetles. Henslow soon became equally fond of Darwin, and the two took long walks together daily, Darwin being known as the man who walks with Henslow. Darwin said of this model teacher years afterward, "He had a remarkable power of making the young feel completely at ease with him, though we were all awe-struck with the amount of his knowledge. Before I saw him, I heard one young man sum up his attainments by simply saying that he knew everything. When I reflect how immediately we felt at ease with a man older and in every way immensely our superior, I think it was as much owing to the transparent sincerity of his character as to his kindness of heart, and perhaps even still more to a highly remarkable absence in him of all self-consciousness. One perceived at once that he never thought of his own varied knowledge or clear intellect, but solely on the subject in hand." Another charm which must have struck everyone was that his manner to old and distinguished persons and to the youngest student was exactly the same, and to all he showed the same winning courtesy. He would receive with interest the most trifling observation in any branch of natural history, and, however absurd a blunder one might make, he pointed it out so clearly and kindly that one left him no way disheartened, but only determined to be more accurate the next time. His lectures on botany were universally popular and as clear as daylight. So popular were they that several of the older members of the university attended successive courses. Once every week he kept open house in the evening, and all who cared for natural history attended these parties which, by thus favouring intercommunication, did the same good in Cambridge in a very pleasant manner as the scientific societies do in London. This was no small advantage to some of the young men, as it stimulated their mental activity and ambition. During the years when I associated so much with Professor Henslow, I never once saw his temper even ruffled. He never took an ill-natured view of anyone's character, though very far from blind to the foibles of others. It always struck me that his mind could not be even touched by any paltry feeling of vanity, envy, or jealousy. With all this equability of temper and remarkable benevolence, there was no insipidity of character. A man must have been blind not to have perceived that beneath this placid exterior there was a vigorous and determined will. When principles came into play, no power on earth could have turned him one hair's breadth. Reflecting over his character with gratitude and reverence, his moral attributes rise, as they should do in the highest character, in preeminence over his intellect. Through this noble friend, Darwin had the opportunity of taking a 5 years' voyage in the ship Beagle as a naturalist. The bark of 235 tons under command of Captain Fitzroy was commissioned by government to survey Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, the shores of Chile, Peru, and some islands in the Pacific, and to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements round the world. Professor Henslow knew the captain and recommended his young friend for the position. Darwin had read Humboldt's travels eagerly and was delighted with the prospect of a journey like this. Dr. Darwin was opposed at first, but finally said, "If you can find any man of common sense who advises you to go, I will give my consent." Young Darwin at once visited his uncle Josiah Wedgwood at Maer, who approved of the journey and soon convinced Dr. Darwin of the wisdom of it. The vessel sailed December 27, 1831. Though for a young man of an extremely affectionate nature the separation from family was painful, yet it was a glad day for Darwin. He had looked forward eagerly to it, saying, "My second life will then commence, and it shall be as a birthday for the rest of my life." And so it proved. He said years afterward, "The voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career." These years were busy, earnest ones, devoted to constant labor. To his father he wrote from Bahia or San Salvador the following spring, "No person could imagine anything so beautiful as the ancient town of Bahia. It is fairly embosomed in a luxuriant wood of beautiful trees, and situated on a steep bank, and overlooks the calm waters of the great bay of All Saints. The houses are white and lofty, and, from the windows being narrow and long, have a very light and elegant appearance. But the exquisite, glorious pleasure of walking amongst such flowers and such trees cannot be comprehended but by those who have experienced it. I will not rapturize again, but I give myself great credit in not being crazy out of pure delight. Give my love to every soul at home. I think one's affections, like other good things, flourish and increase in these tropical regions." Again he writes from Rio de Janeiro, "Here at Rio Macoa I first saw a tropical forest in all its sublime grandeur. Nothing but the reality can give any idea how wonderful, how magnificent the scene is. I never experienced such intense delight. I formerly admired Humboldt. I now almost adore him. He alone gives any notion of the feelings which are raised in the mind on first entering the tropics. I am now collecting fresh water and land animals. I am at present red hot with spiders. They are very interesting, and, if I am not mistaken, I have already taken some new genera." Busy as he was ever thinking of home and anxious to receive letters. When they were received, he almost cried for pleasure. He writes to his sister, "If you knew the glowing, unspeakable delight which I felt at being certain that my father and all of you were well only 4 months ago, you would not grudge the labor lost in keeping up the regular series of letters." Later he writes, "It is too delightful to think that I shall see the leaves fall and hear the robin sing next autumn at Shrewsbury. My feelings are those of a schoolboy to the smallest point. I doubt whether ever boy longed for his holidays as much as I do to see you all again." To his dear Henslow he writes, "It is now some months since we have been at a civilized port. Nearly all this time has been spent in the most southern part of Tierra del Fuego. The Fuegians are in a more miserable state of barbarism than I had expected ever to have seen a human being. In this inclement country they are absolutely naked, and their temporary houses are like what children make in summer with boughs of trees." Captain Fitzroy, on a previous voyage, had carried several natives to England and now brought them again to their own land. They had become, says Darwin, entirely European in their habits and wishes, so much so that the younger one had forgotten his own language, and their countrymen paid but very little attention to them. We built houses for them and planted gardens, but by the time we return again on our passage round the Horn, I think it will be very doubtful how much of their property will be left unstolen. At the Cape of Good Hope, Darwin met and dined with Sir John Herschel. For some time he lived at St. Helena, within a stone's throw of Napoleon's tomb. He became so deeply interested in his geological investigations in South America that he wrote his sister Susan, "I literally could hardly sleep at nights for thinking over my day's work. The scenery was so new and so majestic. Everything at an elevation of 12,000 feet bears so different an aspect from that in a lower country." To another sister he wrote, "I trust and believe that the time spent in this voyage, if thrown away for all other respects, will produce its full worth in natural history. And it appears to me that doing what little we can to increase the general stock of knowledge is as respectable an object of life as one can in any likelihood pursue. What fine opportunities for geology and for studying the infinite host of living beings! Is not this a prospect to keep up the most flagging spirit? If I was to throw it away, I don't think I should ever rest quiet in my grave." Darwin says, "As far as I can judge of myself, I worked to the utmost during the voyage, from the mere pleasure of investigation and from my strong desire to add a few facts to the great mass of facts in natural science. But I was also ambitious to take a fair place among scientific men. In studying the geology of St. Jago, it then first dawned on me that I might perhaps write a book on the geology of the various countries visited, and this made me thrill with delight. That was a memorable hour to me, and how distinctly I can call to mind the low cliff of lava beneath which I rested, with the sun glaring hot, a few strange desert plants growing near, and with living corals in the tidal pools at my feet. Later in the voyage, Fitzroy asked me to read some of my journal and declared it would be worth publishing, so here was a second book in prospect." Darwin, stirred by the right kind of ambition, had found his life work. It would not be in the church, as his father had fondly hoped, but the world would be his audience. On October 5, 1836, Darwin arrived at Shrewsbury after 5 years' absence. He left home a high-spirited, warm-hearted youth, fond of athletic sports and vigorous in body. He came back with a passionate love for science, with the habit of energetic industry and of concentrated attention, but with health impaired, which made the whole of his after-life a battle with suffering. Yet he conquered and gave to his generation a wonderful example of the power of mind over body, of victory over obstacles. During the voyage he was an almost constant sufferer from seasickness. He wrote home the last year, "It is a lucky thing for me that the voyage is drawing to its close, for I positively suffer more from seasickness now than 3 years ago." After perhaps an hour's work, says Admiral Stokes, he would say to me, "Old fellow, I must take the horizontal for it," that being the best relief position from ship motion. A stretch out on one side of the table for some time would enable him to resume his labours for a while, when he had again to lie down. It was distressing to witness this early sacrifice of Mr. Darwin's health, who ever afterwards seriously felt the ill effects of the Beagle's voyage. Admiral Mellersh says, "I think he was the only man I ever knew against whom I never heard a word said, and as people, when shut up in a ship for 5 years, are apt to get cross with each other, that is saying a good deal." Says another, "He was never known to be out of temper, or to say one unkind or hasty word of or to anyone." This lovely spirit which so endeared him to everybody, Darwin kept through life, a spirit which sheds a halo around every book he wrote and makes him worthy the admiration and honour of every young man. Many persons have the gift of writing books, but comparatively few persons have the great gift of self-control. After a brief visit with his family, Darwin hastened to Cambridge to prepare his Journal of Travels. He had learned on the Beagle that a man who dares to waste 1 hour of time has not discovered the value of life. After 3 months' hard work, he went to London, where he finished the journal and began working on his Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle and his Geological Observations. He said at this time, "I have nothing to wish for excepting stronger health to go on with the subjects to which I have joyfully determined to devote my life." For 3 years and 8 months he worked untiringly. He wrote Henslow, "I fear the geology will take me a great deal of time. I was looking over one set of notes, and the quantity I found I had to read for that one place was frightful. If I live till I am 80 years old, I shall not cease to marvel at finding myself an author. In the summer before I started, if anyone had told me that I should have been an angel by this time, I should have thought it an equal impossibility. This marvelous transformation is all owing to you." Darwin and Lyell now became very intimate friends. "I am coming into your way of only working about 2 hours at a spell," he writes to Lyell. "I then go out and do my business in the streets, return and set to work again, and thus make 2 separate days out of one." Of Lyell he said, "One of his chief characteristics was his sympathy with the work of others. The science of geology is enormously indebted to Lyell, more so, as I believe, than to any other man who ever lived." The journal was published in 1839. January 29 of this year, Mr. Darwin, now 30 years of age, was married to his cousin Emma Wedgwood, daughter of Josiah Wedgwood of Maer and granddaughter of the founder of the potteries of Etruria. The extreme happiness of his married life proved the wisdom of his choice. He said in after years, "No one can be too kind to my dear wife, who is worth her weight in gold many times over." They lived at number 12 Upper Gower Street, as he wrote a college mate, "a life of extreme quietness. We have given up all parties, for they agree with neither of us, and if one is quiet in London, there is nothing like its quietness." In 1842 his Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs was published, a book which cost him, he says, 20 months of hard work, as I had to read every work on the islands of the Pacific and to consult many charts. Of this book, Professor Geikie says, "This well-known treatise, the most original of all its author's geological memoirs, has become one of the classics of geological literature. The origin of those remarkable rings of coral rock in mid-ocean has given rise to much speculation, but no satisfactory solution of the problem has been proposed. After visiting many of them and examining also coral reefs that fringe islands and continents, he offered a theory which, for simplicity and grandeur, strikes every reader with astonishment. No more admirable example of scientific method was ever given to the world, and, even if he had written nothing else, this treatise alone would have placed Darwin in the very front of investigators of nature." Lyell wrote to Darwin concerning this book, "It is all true, but do not flatter yourself that you will be believed till you are growing bald like me, with hard work and vexation at the incredulity of the world." Darwin's next work on the volcanic islands visited during the voyage of the Beagle was published in 1844. This book, he said, cost me 18 months. His third geological book, Geological Observations on South America, was published in 1846. Meantime, tired of smoky London, Darwin purchased a home in Down, a retired village 500 or 600 feet above the sea. The house was a square brick building of 3 stories, vine-covered in the midst of 18 acres. Its chief merit, Darwin writes to a friend, is its extreme rurality. "I think I was never in a more perfectly quiet country." Here, for 40 years, Darwin lived the isolated life of a student, producing the books that made him the most noted scientist of his century. Of these years, Mr. Darwin said, "Few persons can have lived a more retired life than we have done. Besides short visits to the houses of relations and occasionally to the seaside or elsewhere, we have gone nowhere. During the first part of our residence, we went a little into society and received a few friends here, but my health almost always suffered from the excitement. I have therefore been compelled for many years to give up all dinner parties. From the same cause I have been able to invite here very few scientific acquaintances. My chief enjoyment and sole employment throughout life has been scientific work, and the excitement from such work makes me for the time forget, or drives quite away, my daily discomfort." At Down, Darwin worked for 8 years on 2 large volumes concerning Cirripedia, barnacles, describing all the known living species. The extinct species, or fossil cirripedes, were in 2 smaller volumes. The first books were published by the Ray Society between 1851 and 1854, the others by the Paleontographical Society. About 2 years out of the 8 were lost through illness. Sometimes he became half discouraged. He wrote a friend, "I have been so steadily going downhill I cannot help doubting whether I can ever crawl a little uphill again. Unless I can, enough to work a little, I hope my life may be very short, for to lie on a sofa all day and do nothing but give trouble to the best and kindest of wives and good dear children is dreadful." Darwin doubted in after life whether the work was worth the consumption of so much time, but Professor Huxley thinks he never did a wiser thing than when he devoted himself to the years of patient toil which the Cirripedes book cost him. The value of the Cirripedes monograph lies not merely in the fact that it is a very admirable piece of work and constituted a great addition to positive knowledge, but still more in the circumstance that it was a piece of critical self-discipline, the effect of which manifested itself in everything he wrote afterwards and saved him from endless errors of detail. Darwin's patient labour is shown by his working for the last half-month daily in dissecting a little animal about the size of a pin's head from the Kronos archipelago, and I could spend another month and daily see more beautiful structure. During these years from 1846 to 1854, death had twice disturbed the quiet life at Down. In 1849, Dr. Darwin died, and his son Charles was so ill that he could not attend the funeral. In 1851, Annie Darwin died at the age of 10 after a brief illness. "She was," said Darwin, "my favourite child. Her cordiality, openness, buoyant joyousness, and strong affections made her most lovable. When quite a baby, this strong affection showed itself in never being easy without touching her mother when in bed with her, and quite lately she would, when poorly, fondle for any length of time one of her mother's arms. She would at almost any time spend half an hour in arranging my hair, making it, as she called it, beautiful, or in smoothing, the poor dear darling, my collar or cuffs. In short, in fondling me. Her whole mind was pure and transparent. One felt one knew her thoroughly and could trust her. I always thought that, come what might, we should have had in our old age at least one loving soul which nothing could have changed. All her movements were vigorous, active, and usually graceful. When going round the sand walk with me, although I walked fast, yet she often used to go before, pirouetting in the most elegant way, her dear face bright all the time with the sweetest smiles. Occasionally she had a pretty coquettish manner towards me, the memory of which is charming. In the last short illness, her conduct, in simple truth, was angelic. She never once complained, never became fretful, was ever considerate of others, and was thankful in the most gentle, pathetic manner for everything done for her. When so exhausted that she could hardly speak, she praised everything that was given her and said some tea was beautifully good. When I gave her some water, she said, "I quite thank you." And these, I believe, were the last precious words ever addressed by her dear lips to me. Such consideration and politeness she naturally inherited. Francis Darwin says in his delightful life of his father, "He always spoke to servants with politeness, using the expression, 'Would you be so good?' in asking for anything." In business matters he was equally courteous. His solicitor, who had never met him, said, "Everything I did was right, and everything was profusely thanked for." Of the drawings made by his children he would say, "Michelangelo is nothing to it." But he always looked carefully at the work and kindly pointed out mistakes. He received, says his son, many letters from foolish, unscrupulous people, and all of these received replies. He used to say that if he did not answer them, he had it on his conscience afterwards, and, no doubt, it was in great measure the courtesy with which he answered every one which produced the universal and widespread sense of his kindness of nature which was so evident on his death. In November 1853, Darwin received the Royal Society's medal. He was gratified, finding it a pleasant little stimulus. When work goes badly and one ruminates that all is vanity, it is pleasant to have some tangible proof that others have thought something of one's labours. November 24, 1859, when Darwin was 50, his great work, Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, was published. For 20 years he had been making experiments with plants and animals and filling his notebooks with facts. To his old classmate, Fox, he writes asking that the boys in his school gather lizards' eggs as well as those of snakes. "My object is," he says, "to see whether such eggs will float on sea water and whether they will keep alive thus floating for a month or two in my cellar. I am trying experiments on transportation of all organic beings that I can, and lizards are found on every island, and therefore I am very anxious to see whether their eggs stand sea water." Again he writes asking Fox for ducklings and dorkings. "The chief point which I am and have been for years very curious about is to ascertain whether the young of our domestic breeds differ as much from each other as do their parents. And I have no faith in anything short of actual measurement and the rule of 3. I have got my fantails and pouters in a grand cage and pigeon house, and they are a decided amusement to me and a delight to H." Of this book, Darwin himself says, "I worked on true Baconian principles and without any theory, collected facts from a wholesale scale, more especially with respect to domesticated productions, by printed inquiries, by conversation with skilful breeders and gardeners, and by extensive reading. When I see the list of books of all kinds which I read and abstracted, including whole series of journals and transactions, I am surprised at my industry. I soon perceived that selection was the keystone of man's success in making useful races of animals and plants. In October 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on, from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. But at that time I overlooked one problem of great importance. This problem is the tendency in organic beings descended from the same stock to diverge in character as they become modified. That they have diverged greatly is obvious from the manner in which species of all kinds can be classed under genera, genera under families, families under suborders, and so forth. The solution, as I believe, is that the modified offspring of all dominant and increasing forms tend to become adapted to many and highly diversified places in the economy of nature. The book was written slowly, each chapter requiring at least 3 months. When The Origin of Species, which had reached its 33rd thousand in 1888, was published, it created the most profound sensation throughout the thinking world. Heretofore, most men of science had believed that each species had been separately created by the Almighty, that species were immutable, unchanging. Mr. Darwin, by 20 years of study, proved to his own mind, and now to most of the world, that there has been a gradual evolution through unnumbered ages of one form of animal life from another. He said, "Probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on the earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed." The theory of evolution was not original to Darwin. Lamarck in 1801 published his Organization of Living Bodies, in which he stated his belief that nature, in all the long ages during which the world has existed, may have produced the different kinds of plants and animals by gradually enlarging one part and diminishing another to suit the wants of each. Geoffrey St. Hilaire, Goethe, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, all believed that species are descended from other species and in various ways improved. Some of the reasons for the belief in evolution are so simply and clearly stated by Arabella B. Buckley in her Short History of Natural Science that I quote her words. "All the animals of each class are formed on the same plan. Why should the animals of one class, such as the vertebrate or backboned class, be formed all on one plan, even to the most minute bones, so that the wing of a bat, the front leg of a horse, the hand of a man, and the flapper of a porpoise are all made of the same bones, which have either grown together or lengthened and spread apart, according to the purpose they serve? And, more curious still, why should some animals have parts which are of no use to them, but only seem to be there because other animals of the same class also have them? Thus, the whale has teeth like the other mammalia, but they never pierce through the gum, and the boa constrictor has the beginnings of hind legs, hidden under its skin, though they never grow out. Here again it seems extraordinary, if a boa constrictor and a whale were created separately, that they should be made with organs which are quite useless, while, on the other hand, if they were descended from the same ancestor as other reptiles and mammalia who have teeth and hind legs, they might be supposed to have inherited these organs. Embryos of animals alike in structure. Another still more remarkable fact was that pointed out by von Baer, that the higher animals, such as quadrupeds, before they are perfectly formed, cannot be distinguished from the embryos of other and lower animals, such as fish and reptiles. If animals were created separately, why should a dog begin like a fish, a lizard and a bird, and have at first parts which it loses as it grows into its own peculiar form? Living animals of a country agree with the fossil ones. We know that certain animals are only found in particular countries, kangaroos and pouched animals, for example, in Australia, and sloths and armadillos in South America. Now, it is remarkable that all the fossil quadrupeds in Australia are also pouched animals, though they are of different kinds and larger in size than those now living. And in the same way, different species of sloth and armadillos are found fossil in South America, while in the rocks of Europe, fossil mammalia are found, only slightly different from those which are living there now. It seems natural to conclude that the living have descended from the fossils. The study of the rocks has produced other missing links in the succession of animal life. Professor Huxley, in some lectures given in New York in 1876, described the Hesperornis found in the Western Rocks, a huge bird, 5 or 6 feet in length, with teeth like a reptile. In England, a fossil reptile has been found, the Archaeopteryx, having a reptile-like tail with a fringe of feathers on each side and teeth, occupying a midway place between a bird and a reptile. Flying reptiles have been found, and reptiles which walked on their hind legs. Those who have visited Yale and Amherst colleges must have seen the huge bird tracks or reptile footprints taken from the rocks in the Connecticut Valley. Professor Huxley showed the probable descent of the horse with its hoofed foot from the extinct three-toed hipparion of Europe, and that from the four-toed Orohippus of the Eocene formation. He declared it probable that a five-toed horse would be found, and Professor Marsh in the West has found the Eohippus, corresponding very nearly to Professor Huxley's description. The question among naturalists was, how can plants and animals have become thus changed? Darwin showed how it was possible to effect most of these changes by natural selection, or the choosing of the best to survive in the struggle for existence. As man by grafting secures the finest fruit, and by care in animal life the swiftest horses for speed, as well as the strongest for labour, so nature selects her best for the higher development of the race. Darwin says, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. Even slow-breeding man has doubled in 25 years, and at this rate, in less than 1,000 years, there would literally not be standing room for his progeny." The elephant is reckoned the slowest breeder of all known animals. It will be safest to assume that it begins breeding when 30 years old and goes on breeding till 90 years old, bringing forth 6 young in the interval and surviving till 100 years old. If this be so, after a period from 740 to 750 years, there would be nearly 19 million elephants alive, descended from the first pair. In various ways, the weakest are destroyed. Darwin, on a piece of ground 3 feet long and 2 wide, says, "I marked all the seedlings of our native weeds as they came up, and out of 357, no less than 295 were destroyed, chiefly by slugs and insects." He gives this interesting instance of the struggle for existence. "I find from experiments that humble bees are almost indispensable to the fertilization of the heart's ease, for other bees do not visit this flower. Humble bees alone visit red clover, as other bees cannot reach the nectar. Hence we may infer as highly probable that, if the whole genus of humble bees became extinct or very rare in England, the heartsease and red clover would become very rare or wholly disappear. The number of humble bees in any district depends in a great measure upon the number of field mice, which destroy their combs and nests. The number of mice is largely dependent, as everyone knows, on the number of cats. Hence, as Mr. Darwin shows, the frequency of certain flowers in a district may depend upon the number of cats. Darwin showed by most interesting experiments with pigeons that the various breeds come from the wild rock pigeon, that dogs are descended probably from the wolf, that different varieties can be produced and perpetuated under changing conditions of life, that species are only well-marked and permanent varieties. He showed how organs can be changed by use or disuse, such as the erect ears of wild animals become drooping under domestication, or moles have only rudimentary eyes covered with skin or fur because not needed for sight. In The Origin of Species, the theory of evolution received proof which was so nearly incontrovertible that the subject was brought prominently before the world as never before. Mr. Alfred Russel Wallace, an able scientist, came to the same conclusion as Darwin in regard to the power of natural selection, and published at the same time as The Origin an essay on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. At once, Darwin was attacked from every quarter. Probably not since Galileo showed that the earth moves around the sun has a man been so censored and persecuted for his opinions as was Darwin. He was declared atheistic, unsettling the Christian belief and opposed to the teachings of the Bible. Professor Asa Gray of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a devoted Christian and able scientist, defended and explained Darwin's views, now published in Darwiniana, claiming that the doctrine of evolution is in no wise opposed to the power and goodness of the Almighty, and quotes Charles Kingsley's words, "We know of old that God was so wise that he could make all things, but behold, he is so much wiser than even that he can make all things make themselves." Kingsley wrote Darwin, "I have gradually learnt to see that it is just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development into all forms needful pro tempore and pro loco, as to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the lacunas which he himself had made. I question whether the former be not the loftier thought." Gray believed that to do any work by an instrument must require, and therefore presuppose, the exertion rather of more than of less power than to do it directly. Darwin said, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Darwin always felt grateful to Asa Gray for his defense. He wrote him, "I declare that you know my book as well as I do myself, and bring to the question new lines of illustration and argument in a manner which excites my astonishment and almost my envy. I said in a former letter that you were a lawyer, but I made a gross mistake. I am sure that you are a poet. No, I will tell you what you are, a hybrid, a complex cross of lawyer, poet, naturalist, and theologian." Darwin wisely made no reply to his critics. He said, years later, "My views have often been grossly misrepresented, bitterly opposed and ridiculed, but this has been generally done, as I believe, in good faith. On the whole, I do not doubt that my works have been over and over again greatly overpraised. I rejoice that I have avoided controversies, and this I owe to Lyell, who, many years ago, in reference to my geological works, strongly advised me never to get entangled in a controversy, as it rarely did any good, and caused a miserable loss of time and temper. Whenever I have found out that I have blundered or that my work has been imperfect, and when I have been contemptuously criticized, and even when I have been overpraised so that I have felt mortified, it has been my greatest comfort to say hundreds of times to myself that I have worked as hard and as well as I could, and no man can do more than this." The Origin has been translated into French, German, Italian, Dutch, Russian, Swedish, and many other languages. Huxley says of it, "Even a cursory glance at the history of the biological sciences during the last quarter of a century is sufficient to justify the assertion that the most potent instrument for the extension of the realm of natural knowledge which has come into men's hands since the publication of Newton's Principia is Darwin's Origin of Species." The year after The Origin was published, Darwin began arranging his notes for his two large volumes, Variation of Animals and Plants under Domestication, which, however, were not published till 1868. On these two books he spent over 4 years. They are a wonderful collection of facts, gathered from books and from his own marvelous experiments and observations, confirming and illustrating the law of natural selection given in the Origin. Darwin had already received the Copley Medal of the Royal Society, the greatest honour a scientific man can receive in England, and the Prussian Order pour le Mérite, founded by Frederick II. The order consists of 30 German members and a few distinguished foreigners. In 1862, the Fertilization of Orchids was published, which required 10 months of labour. In this work, Darwin took the utmost delight. He wrote to a friend who had sent him some of these flowers, "It is impossible to thank you enough. I was almost mad at the wealth of orchids. I never was more interested in any subject in my life than in this of orchids." The peculiarities of the flowers therein described, as Darwin says, transcend in an incomparable manner the contrivances and adaptations which the most fertile imagination of man could invent. In the Origin, he describes an orchid which has part of its labellum, or lower lip, hollowed out into a great bucket, into which drops of almost pure water continuously fall from 2 secreting horns which stand above it. And when the bucket is half full, the water overflows by a spout on one side. The basal part of the labellum stands over the bucket, and is itself hollowed out into a sort of chamber with 2 lateral entrances. Within this chamber there are curious fleshy ridges. The most ingenious man, if he had not witnessed what takes place, could never have imagined what purpose all these parts serve. But Dr. Kruger saw crowds of large humble bees visiting the gigantic flowers of this orchid, not in order to suck nectar, but to gnaw off the ridges within the chamber above the bucket. In doing this, they frequently pushed each other into the bucket, and their wings being thus wetted, they could not fly away, but were compelled to crawl out through the passage formed by the spout or overflow. The passage is narrow and is roofed over by the column, so that a bee, in forcing its way out, first rubs its back against the viscid stigma and then against the viscid glands of the pollen masses. The pollen masses are thus glued to the back of the bee, which first happens to crawl out through the passage of a lately expanded flower and are thus carried away. When the bee, thus provided, flies to another flower or to the same flower a second time and is pushed by its comrades into the bucket and then crawls out by the passage, the pollen mass necessarily comes first into contact with the viscid stigma and adheres to it, and the flower is fertilized. Now at last we see the full use of every part of the flower, of the water-secreting horns, of the bucket half full of water, which prevents the bees from flying away, and forces them to crawl out through the spout and rub against the properly placed viscid pollen masses and the viscid stigma. Darwin said, "The botanists praise my orchid book to the skies. There is a superb, but I fear exaggerated, review in the London Review, but I have not been a fool, as I thought I was, to publish, for Asa Gray, about the most competent judge in the world, thinks almost as highly of the book as does the London Review." Darwin wrote several other books on plants. The Movements and Habits of Climbing Plants was published in 1875, Insectivorous Plants in 1875, Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in 1876, The Different Forms of Flowers on Plants of the Same Species in 1877, The Power of Movement in Plants in 1880. When writing his Different Forms of Flowers, he said, "I am all on fire at the work, and of insectivorous plants, I have been working like a madman at Drosera. Here is a fact for you which is certain as you stand where you are, though you won't believe it, that a bit of hair, 1/78,000th of 1 grain in weight, placed on gland, will cause one of the gland-bearing hairs of Drosera to curve inwards, and will alter the condition of the content of every cell in the footstalk of the gland." But he was growing tired with his constant and multifarious labours. He wrote to Hooker, You ask about my book, and all that I can say is that I am ready to commit suicide. I thought it was decently written, but find so much wants rewriting that it will not be ready to go to printers for 2 months, and will then make a confoundedly big book. Murray will say that it is no use publishing in the middle of summer, so I do not know what will be the upshot, but I begin to think that everyone who publishes a book is a fool. In 1871, The Descent of Man was published. He worked on this book 3 years, and he wrote to his friend, Sir J.D. Hooker, that it has half killed him. For the first edition, Darwin received over $7,000. It had an immense circulation in England and America and created a furor in Germany. Darwin believed that man is descended from a hairy quadruped, furnished with a tail and pointed ears, probably arboreal in its habits and an inhabitant of the Old World. This creature, if its whole structure had been examined by a naturalist, would have been classed among the quadrumana, as surely as would the common and still more ancient progenitor of the Old and New World monkeys. The quadrumana and all the higher mammals are probably derived from an ancient marsupial animal, and this through a long line of diversified forms, either from some reptile-like or some amphibian-like creature, and this again from some fish-like animal. In the dim obscurity of the past, we can see that the early progenitor of all the vertebrata must have been an aquatic animal, provided with branchiae, with the 2 sexes united in the same individual, and with the most important organs of the body, such as the brain and heart, imperfectly developed. This animal seems to have been more like the larva of our existing marine ascidians than any known form. Most naturalists believe, with Darwin, that man has developed from some lower form, but many urge that at some stage of development he received the gift of speech and mental and moral powers from an omnipotent creator. Darwin received much abuse and much ridicule for his views. Mr. James D. Haig tells in Harper's Magazine of a visit paid to the great scientist when a picture in the Hornet was shown, the body of a gorilla with the head of Darwin. The latter laughed and said, "The head is cleverly done, but the gorilla is bad. Too much chest. It couldn't be like that." The Descent of Man shows the widest research and is a storehouse of most interesting facts. Sexual selection shows some of the most remarkable provisions of nature and is as interesting as any novel. This book, like The Origin, has been translated into various languages. In 1872, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals was published. Over 5,000 copies were sold on the day of publication. It was begun at the birth of his first child 33 years before. He says, "I at once commenced to make notes on the first dawn of the various expressions which he exhibited, for I felt convinced, even at this early period, that the most complex and fine shades of expression must all have had a gradual and natural origin." He wrote to a college friend regarding this baby, "He is so charming that I cannot pretend to any modesty. I defy anybody to flatter us on our baby, for I defy anyone to say anything in its praise of which we are not fully conscious. I had not the smallest conception there was so much in a 5-month baby. You will perceive by this that I have a fine degree of paternal fervour." In 1881, the formation of vegetable mould through the action of worms with observations on their habits was published. Fragments of burnt marl, cinders, etc., which had been thickly strewed over the surface of several meadows, were found, after a few years, lying at a depth of some inches beneath the turf, but still forming a layer. Ascertaining that this was the work of worms, Darwin made a study of their structure, habits and work, in his garden, his fields, and in pots of earth kept in his study. The intelligence of worms, the construction of their burrows, and the amount of labor they can perform are described in a most entertaining manner. Over 50,000 worms are found in a single acre of land, or about 356 pounds. In many parts of England, a weight of more than 10 tons of dry earth annually passes through their bodies and is brought to the surface on each acre of land. Worms prepare the ground in an excellent manner for the growth of fibrous-rooted plants and for seedlings of all kinds. They periodically expose the mold to the air and sift it so that no stones larger than the particles which they can swallow are left in it. They mingle the whole intimately together like a gardener who prepares fine soil for his choicest plants. The plough is one of the most ancient and most valuable of man's inventions, but long before he existed, the land was in fact regularly ploughed and still continues to be thus ploughed by earthworms. It may be doubted whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as have these lowly organized creatures. In 3 years, 8,500 copies of the earthworms were sold. Mr. Darwin was now 72 years old. Already many honours had come to him after the severe and bitter censure. In 1877 he received the degree of LL.D. from Cambridge University. In 1878 he was elected a corresponding member of the French Institute and of the Berlin Academy of Sciences. In 1879 he received the Bailey Medal of the Royal College of Physicians. In 1879 from the Royal Academy of Turin the Bresser Prize of 12,000 francs. He valued highly 2 photographic albums sent from Germany and Holland. One containing the pictures of 154 noted scientific men, the other of 217 lovers of natural science in the Netherlands. He wrote in thanks, "I am well aware that my books could never have been written and would not have made any impression on the public mind had not an immense amount of material been collected by a long series of admirable observers, and it is to them that honour is chiefly due. I suppose that every worker at science occasionally feels depressed and doubts whether what he has published has been worth the labour which it has cost him. But for the few remaining years of my life, whenever I want cheering, I will look at the portraits of my distinguished co-workers in the field of science and remember their generous sympathy." He was made a member of more than 70 of the learned societies of the world, in America, Austria, India, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Darwin's work was now almost over. His dear friend Lyell had gone before him, of whom he said, "I never forget that almost everything which I have done in science I owe to the study of his great works." His brother Erasmus, to whom he was tenderly attached, died in 1881. In the spring of 1882 he was unable to work continuously as usual and suffered from pain about the heart. On the night of April 18 he had a severe attack and fainted. When he was restored to consciousness he said, "I am not the least afraid to die." He died the next day, April 19. Darwin died as he had lived, with a heart overflowing with sympathy and tenderness. He said, "I feel no remorse from having committed any great sin, but have often and often regretted that I have not done more direct good to my fellow creatures." In his home life he was singularly blessed. His son says, "No one except my mother knows the full amount of suffering he endured, or the full amount of his wonderful patience. For all the latter years of his life she never left him for a night, and her days were so planned that all his resting hours might be shared with her. She shielded him from every avoidable annoyance and omitted nothing that might save him trouble or prevent him becoming overtired, or that might alleviate the many discomforts of his ill health. I hesitate to speak thus freely of a thing so sacred as the lifelong devotion which prompted all this constant and tender care. But it is a principal feature of his life that for nearly 40 years he never knew one day of the health of ordinary men, and that thus his life was one long struggle against the weariness and strain of sickness. And yet he accomplished all his wonderful work. In his relationship towards my mother, his tender and sympathetic nature was shown in its most beautiful aspect. In her presence he found his happiness, and through her his life, which might have been overshadowed by gloom, became one of content and quiet gladness. He was the idol of his children, who used to bribe him with sixpence to come and play in working hours. We all knew the sacredness of working time, says Mr. Darwin's daughter, but that any one should resist sixpence seemed an impossibility. Another mark of his unbounded patience was the way in which we were suffered to make raids into the study when we had an absolute need for sticking plaster, string, pins, scissors, stamps, foot rule or hammer. These and other such necessaries were always to be found in the study, and it was the only place where this was a certainty. We used to feel it wrong to go in during work time. Still, when the necessity was great, we did so. I remember his patient look when he said once, "Don't you think you could not come in again? I have been interrupted very often." He cared for all our pursuits and interests and lived our lives with us in a way that very few fathers do. His son says, "The way he brought us up is shown by a little story about my brother Leonard, which my father was fond of telling. He came into the drawing-room and found Leonard dancing about on the sofa, which was forbidden for the sake of the springs, and said, 'Oh, Lenny, Lenny, that's against all rules,' and received for answer, 'Then I think you'd better go out of the room.' I do not believe he ever spoke an angry word to any of his children in his life, but I am certain that it never entered our heads to disobey him. How often when a man I have wished, when my father was behind my chair, that he would pass his hand over my hair, as he used to do when I was a boy. He allowed his grown-up children to laugh with and at him, and was generally speaking on terms of perfect equality with us. He was very fond of flowers, and also of dogs. When he had been absent from home, on his return his white fox terrier, Polly, would get wild with excitement, panting, squeaking, rushing about the room and jumping on and off the chairs, and he used to stoop down, pressing her face to his, letting her lick him, and speaking to her with a peculiarly tender, caressing voice. He was very tender-hearted. A friend who often visited at Down told me that Mrs. Darwin one day urged her husband to punish the little dog for some wrongdoing. He took the animal tenderly in his arms and carried her out of doors, patting her gently on the head. "Why, Charles," remonstrated the wife, "she did not feel it." He replied, "I could do no more." The remembrance of screams or other sounds heard in Brazil, says Francis Darwin, when he was powerless to interfere with what he believed to be the torture of a slave, haunted him for years, especially at night. In smaller matters, when he could interfere, he did so vigorously. He returned one day from his walk pale and faint, from having seen a horse ill-used, and from the agitation of violently remonstrating with the man. On another occasion he saw a horse-breaker teaching his son to ride. The little boy was frightened, and the man was rough. My father stopped and, jumping out of the carriage, reproved the man in no measured terms. A visitor, driving from Orpington to Down, told the man to go faster. "Why," said the driver, "if I had whipped the horse this much driving Mr. Darwin, he would have got out of the carriage and abused me well." His manner was bright and animated, and his face glowed in conversation. He enjoyed fun, had a merry, ringing laugh, and a happy way of turning things. He said once, "Gray, Asa Gray of Harvard College, often takes me to task for making hasty generalizations. But the last time he was here talking that way, I said to him, 'Now, Gray, I have one more generalization to make which is not hasty, and that is the Americans are the most delightful people I know.'" He was particularly charming when chaffing anyone, says his son, and in high spirits over it. His manner at such times was light-hearted and boyish, and his refinement of nature came out most strongly. So when he was talking to a lady who pleased and amused him, the combination of raillery and deference in his manner was delightful to see. When my father had several guests, he managed them well, getting a talk with each or bringing 2 or 3 together round his chair. My father much enjoyed wandering slowly in the garden with my mother or some of his children, or making one of a party, sitting out on a bench on the lawn. He generally sat, however, on the grass, and I remember him often lying under one of the big lime trees, with his head on the green mound at its foot. He had great perseverance in his work, and used often to say, "It's dogged as does it," and "saving the minutes is the way to get work done." It was his habit to rise early in the morning, and after breakfast work from 8 to 9:30, and then read his letters. At 10 or 9:30 he went back to his work till 12, after exercise in the sand walk, a narrow strip of land, 1½ acres in extent, with a gravel walk round it, planted with a variety of trees, in which he watched the birds and squirrels. He lunched and read his newspaper. After this he wrote letters, and about 3 o'clock rested for a time on the sofa, some of his family reading to him, often a novel, the work of Walter Scott, George Eliot, Miss Austen, or others. At 4 he walked again, worked from 4:30 till 5:30, dined, and usually spent his evenings, after a game of backgammon with his wife or hearing her play on the piano, in reading scientific books. Conversation in the evening usually spoiled his rest for the night, but he could do a great amount of work if he kept to his regular routine. In each book, as he read it, he marked passages bearing on his work. In reading a book or pamphlet, he made pencil lines at the side of the page, often adding short remarks, and at the end made a list of the pages marked. Darwin said of himself, "At no time am I a quick thinker or writer. Whatever I have done in science has solely been by long pondering, patience, and industry. I think that I am superior to the common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention, and in observing them carefully. My industry has been nearly as great as it could have been in the observation and collection of facts. What is far more important, my love of natural science has been steady and ardent." This pure love has, however, been much aided by the ambition to be esteemed by my fellow naturalists. From my early youth I have had the strongest desire to understand or explain whatever I observed, that is, to group all facts under some general laws. My habits are methodical, and this has been of not a little use for my particular line of work. Lastly, I have had ample leisure from not having to earn my own bread. Even ill health, though it has annihilated several years of my life, has saved me from the distractions of society and amusement. Mr. Darwin was never egotistical or elated by his great success. He always felt and spoke modestly of his work. In the village people of Down he took a cordial interest, helping to found a friendly club, which he served as treasurer for 30 years. He also acted for some years as a county magistrate. The vicar of Down, Reverend J. Brodie Innes, and Mr. Darwin were firm friends for 30 years, yet, says Darwin, "We never thoroughly agreed on any subject but once, and then we stared hard at each other and thought one of us must be very ill." In the hall of the Great Natural History Museum in London, a statue of Darwin was placed June 9, 1885, with appropriate addresses. Darwin's life is a most interesting study. That a boy who seemed in youth to have no special fondness for books, but an especial delight in collecting beetles, who appeared unfitted either for medicine or the church, should come to such a renowned manhood is remarkable. His perseverance, his industry, his thought, his gentleness, his sunny nature in the midst of suffering are delightful to contemplate. His books will be an enduring monument. He combined a great intellect and a great heart, which makes the most attractive nature in either man or woman.